Today, we're going to learn about a little boy in India who for a time seemed like he was the worst behaved kid on the planet. But the truth was, that little boy had a huge secret. And when his secret got out, it changed everything anyone thought they knew about this boy, and it prompted all these big-time college professors from major universities all around the world to personally fly to India to investigate this kid's claims, because the implications of what he was saying were massive. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's roll-on deodorant ball with a single clove of garlic. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was Titu, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. Titu, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, honestly, it just seemed like Titu was getting worse and worse by the second. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived. But again, Shanti just felt like really there was nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. Titu was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy or was fighting with his siblings or something. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why Titu was throwing this tantrum, because Titu threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken Titu to the local doctor, and he'd been examined, and the doctor said, "Look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him. So whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's got to be psychological." Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. But as she did that, Titu turned around and tried to hit her in the face and kicked her and punched her. And so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed. And Titu, at this point, who's still throwing this huge tantrum, he leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Now, Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, her husband, outside to wait out this current Titu tantrum. And so for a second, Shanti thought about just laying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler just kind of run around the house until he was done throwing this tantrum. But as Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. And so she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, and there was Titu looking down at the ground where there was a shattered plate on the ground. Clearly, Titu had smashed it on purpose. And so as furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that, nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. And so right now, the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. And so Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to Titu, who's still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she's coming near him. And she grabbed him, she turned him around so he couldn't kick her or punch her. She put him into his room and then shut the door. And then she sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. And then as Titu inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti's sitting there anchoring the door, and she's just praying that her son's gonna calm down soon. And then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. Titu in the bedroom began saying the word Shirsh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti and her husband and the other kids had no idea what it meant. But, Titu, at the end of his tantrums, he would always just start saying over and over again, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. And so Shanti, she's in the hall and she's hearing Titu start to do that. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end. But on the other, she's like, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at Titu to explain what Shirsh Verma meant, but Titu had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again. Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this, not at all. And in fact, T2 had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with T2, she'd become very, very sick, and in fact had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. And then as a newborn baby, T2 basically didn't sleep at all, and he cried constantly, and so Shanti and her husband initially thought, T2 must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that T2 was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. Because the things T2 was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that T2 would use during his temper tantrums, shurshverma. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes, and Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat, and they were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, like above and beyond a modest life. And T2 had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all T2 wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when T2's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, T2 would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. T2 would also walk around their house, and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, T2 would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car, and why aren't we driving in a car? Like, why are we walking? Despite the fact that T2 basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of T2's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but T2 had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra, like his family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time T2 began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, T2 would throw a huge tantrum. And so not long after T2 had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that really all they could do was just wait and hope their son grew out of this terrible behavior. But T2 did not grow out of this. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, T2 would randomly attack another small child with a sugarcane, and he beat the kid so badly the kid was bleeding at the end of the attack. And then also another time, shortly after the sugarcane beating, T2 was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. She was just looking at it through the glass, and T2 sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, that T2 will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. And so after this, Shanti and her husband just stopped taking T2 out in public at all. It was just too embarrassing. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that T2 kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums, shurshverma, shurshverma. And so fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, T2 began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, shurshverma, he was saying 2 words. They were Suresh Varma. But Shanti had no idea what that meant. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. But one day, a few months after the dish-breaking incident, in April of 1987, all of T2's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house to play, study, whatever. But T2 was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen and he asked his mother, "Hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra?" Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that T2 was totally obsessed with. And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, T2, who was sitting in the kitchen, he heard it and kind of looked up like he was totally fixated on their conversation. And then as Shanti and her oldest were talking about the dad, T2 just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room. He grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him. And he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old child. This is not a teenager. This is a little kid. And so Shanti and her oldest son, they kind of watched in shock as T2 ran off down the road. And for a minute, neither of them did anything. And then it was like they broke out of their trance, and the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with T2. Now, it didn't take long for the oldest to catch up with his young brother, but it was surprisingly hard to stop T2 from trying to run away. He fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. And then when the older brother got T2 back inside, Shanti looked at her older son and she saw he had a black eye from where T2 had just hit him. And when Shanti turned to T2 to try to get him to apologize to his brother for hitting him, she saw T2 was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. And so Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope in getting him to calm down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. And so Shanti and the oldest just basically restrained T2 so he couldn't hurt himself or one of them or damage anything. And for a while, as they held him to the ground, T2 just continued to scream and flail and throw this fit. But eventually he did kind of calm down and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. T2, in addition to saying periodically Suresh Verma, also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And T2 kept saying, "Why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me?" And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks, you know what? This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. Maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. And so once T2 fully stopped his temper tantrum and Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him, once T2 had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now. Just go there and look for a radio store or something. Look for anything that could be a clue to what's going on with T2. He obviously has some fixation with the city. Just go, look around, see if you can find something. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. Now, Shanti had no idea if her oldest son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured, she's got nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And right away, Shanti could tell, clearly, he's discovered something. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, "Tomorrow, we're going to have visitors." Are you a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious? If so, then you're in luck. Because our massively popular show, the MrBallen podcast, which since the end of 2022 has been exclusively on the Amazon Music platform, is now available on all podcast platforms, and it's free. There are over 200 episodes in the back catalog of this show. And of those 200, at least half of them have never been told on YouTube. They are only available on the podcast. And you can find those exclusive episodes by looking for the words podcast exclusive in the individual episode title. So again, the highly popular MrBallen podcast is once again available on all podcast platforms, and it is free. To listen, just search for the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music or wherever else you get your podcasts, and then give the show a follow and then start your binge. Oh, and also, if you are one of the amazing people who subscribe to Amazon Music to follow the MrBallen podcast when it went exclusive, don't give up your membership just yet, because there are still huge perks for listening to the show on Amazon Music. With your Prime membership, you can listen to new episodes of the MrBallen podcast 30 days early and ad-free on Amazon Music. But again, the show is now available on all podcast platforms, and it really is free. So, thank you so much. Have a nice binge. The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home, and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men who also appeared to be in their 30s, and they were all wearing suits and jackets. And there was also an older couple, a man and a woman, and the man was wearing this beautiful sweater, and the woman had on all this silk. It was clear, just from the way they looked, that these 6 people were not from this area. They were from somewhere else, and they had a ton of money. Now, Shanti was inside the house and she was watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus T2, had decided the night before, when they knew these visitors were going to arrive, that they wouldn't go out and talk to them. Instead, they would just allow T2 to basically make first contact with these people and see what happens. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, kind of waiting to be let in, she called for T2 and said, "Hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests." And so T2, who was not throwing a fit at this point, he came running through the house and he went to the door. He's not looked outside yet. He opens up the door and he runs outside and he sees these 6 people on the other side of the gate. And suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying, because she knew, even before T2 had made that joyous sound when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard T2 from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then she led them through the house to the back deck. And then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, T2, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from T2, and T2 is just locked on her. Now, at this point, nobody is speaking. Everybody is just sitting there. No introductions have been made, so nobody even knows each other's names. And in this kind of tense and awkward silence, T2, who again is just staring at this woman in red, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then T2 looked up at her and he smiled and he said, "Do you know who I am?" And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, "No, I don't." And T2 would look back up at her and he would say, "I know who you are. You're Uma." And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, T2 continued. And he said to her, "Hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets?" And at this, the woman in the red sari, Uma, she had this new look come over her face. Instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at T2, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, T2's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen, and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here, and suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors. And without saying anything, Shanti went straight to T2, she pushed his head to the side, exposing his right ear, and she used those scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear, kind of exposing the right side of his skull. And as the hair on T2's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, T2 was just smiling. To understand what just happened out on that back porch between these random people and Shanti and her family, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to go investigate and look for clues that could explain what was going on with T2. The brother and his friend had driven all around Agra, looking for radio stores and looking for things that might in some way kind of connect to T2, and they didn't see anything. But at some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. So the older brother and the friend, they parked their car and they went into this particular radio shop, and inside of there is where they met Uma, the woman who had the red sari on, who was in her 30s, that T2 said we went to the fair together with, that woman. So she's inside this radio shop, and when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, that was when things began to fall into place for this older brother about what was going on with T2. Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband, except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. He was shot and killed, and so she had been running the shop ever since. And Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, since taking it over, but she just couldn't bring herself to change it because the shop's name was actually based on her husband's name. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma, the two words that T2 would say all the time at the end of his tantrums. Suresh Verma, Suresh Verma. That was Uma's husband. And it would turn out the details of Suresh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with T2's birth. And all of T2's totally erratic, strange, terrible behavior throughout really his entire life to this point now suddenly made sense if you knew about Suresh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with T2 was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered T2's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in T2. This reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was always saying Suresh Verma, because in theory that was his real name. That's the guy who died, who then his spirit transitioned to T2, so he's saying his name over and over again. And then also T2's obsession with Agra would make sense, because that's where Suresh's radio shop was and where he lived. Also, the reincarnation theory would explain why T2 was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, basically accusing them of being poor and kind of living below his station. Well, Suresh's family was very, very wealthy, and so that was the lifestyle Suresh had lived. And so if his spirit was now in T2's body, he might be at odds with their lifestyle. And lastly, the reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that T2 had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Now, these were birthmarks that Shanti was well aware of, but after she learned about how Suresh Verma was killed, he was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear, right here. When she heard that, she ran and got the scissors. She cut the hair away around T2's ear, revealing the two birthmarks. And then the other families saw those birthmarks, and they're like, oh my goodness, that is literally where the entry and exit wounds were on Suresh. And then also, it's worth pointing out that on the day Suresh was shot and killed, well, basically that day was when T2's mother, Shanti, began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with T2, and she had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about T2 and Suresh Verma, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected T2 to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what T2 wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. And so that's what they did. Uma and the other wealthy family, they made visits all the time to see T2 and vice versa. The families got along great. And as for T2, he was really happy. His bad behavior basically went away and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. And T2 has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India. In the very early morning hours of December 26, 1980, Airman Steve Longaro was on a foot patrol at the Royal Air Force Base near Rendlesham Forest in the UK. And as Longaro walked along, suddenly this alarm sounded across the base. And based on the sound of this alarm, Longaro knew this was not a drill. And so instinctively he turned and began sprinting towards his assigned firing position right along the perimeter of the base. And as Longaro ran towards his position, he looked around him and he saw hundreds of other soldiers doing the exact same thing. But once Longaro actually reached his firing position and looked out, looking for the threat that's coming into the base, he realized he didn't see anything. But then when he turned to look at his colleagues to ask them, what's going on here, he noticed everybody else was not even looking outside the base. They were kind of looking off to the side towards Rendlesham Forest, because there was something out there kind of hovering in the trees that was casting this very eerie red light over everything. And this was just the beginning of what would go on to be one of the most credible and unsettling paranormal events in history. If you want to hear this absolutely crazy story, then you need to check out one of our newest podcasts out of Ballen Studios. It's called the Bedtime Stories Podcast, and they're the ones that covered this story, and the name of this episode is the Rendlesham Forest Incident, and they just published it a couple of days ago. So look up the Bedtime Stories Podcast on any podcast platform, give them a follow, and then start listening. Enjoy. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories a lot like this one. You can listen to the MrBallen Podcast on Amazon Music or wherever you get your podcasts. Enjoy. Wait, don't go anywhere. If you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious videos, click here. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel, because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please remove all the raisins from the like button's raisin brand. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. From 2000 to 2013, Cornelius Mike Anderson miraculously turned his life around. Growing up in a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri, Mike was a troubled young man that seemed destined for jail time. But something changed for him in the year 2000 when he was 23 years old. Suddenly, he wanted to make the most out of his life. So he distanced himself from his old friends and he moved to a different suburb outside of St. Louis called Webster Groves. There, he started a successful construction company. He got married, divorced, married again. He had 3 kids and became the father to a stepchild. He was very active in his community, volunteering countless hours at his church, as well as becoming a youth football coach. Anyone that met Mike after the year 2000 only had wonderful things to say about him. But Mike had a big secret about his past that he was just hoping never saw the light of day. Back in 1999, when Mike was 23 years old, he robbed a Burger King outside of St. Louis at gunpoint. He was arrested in the year 2000, convicted of armed robbery, and sentenced to 13 years in prison. Shortly after his conviction, he was out on bail pending the outcome of his appeal. But when his appeal was denied in May of 2002, Mike was expecting to go back to jail. And so he asked his lawyer, what are the next steps? Because I'm out on bail. Do I go to the jail? Do they come to get me? And his lawyer said, oh no, they'll issue a warrant for your arrest. They will come to your house and they will take you to jail. So Mike got his affairs in order and he waited to go to jail. But no one ever showed up. And so days turned into weeks, turned into years, and no one ever took Mike to jail. Because it would turn out the state had made a clerical error, and they believed Mike was already behind bars when he was actually just at his home. And in July of 2013, at the end of his original 13-year sentence, they went to go release him from prison. That's when they realized he had never been incarcerated. So 8 U.S. Marshals immediately went to his house and they arrested him and they brought him to jail. And there was this huge public outcry outcry, that it was totally unjust that you're arresting him now because it's the state's fault that they did not bring him to jail. It's not Mike's fault. And Mike used that opportunity to become a totally changed man. And so after a number of appeals and this very public petition of people trying to get Mike out of jail, a judge finally took a closer look at Mike's case. And it would take this judge only 10 minutes to come to the conclusion that Mike was in fact a changed man and should not have to serve the rest of his sentence. And so although Mike was held for 9 months after being rearrested, he was released, and today he is a free man. The Tromp family were by all accounts a normal, hard-working household. 51-year-old Mark Tromp and his wife, 53-year-old Kobe Tromp, had established a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in Sylvan, which is just outside of Melbourne. Their 3 adult children, which were 29-year-old Rihanna, 25-year-old Mitchell, and 22-year-old Ella, all lived and worked with them at the farm. But their seemingly ordinary lives would change forever on Monday, August 29th, 2016. That day, without any warning, the family dumped their passports, credit cards, and cell phones on the kitchen table and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked. They hopped into Ella's car and drove north. 30 kilometers into their journey, and it was discovered that the son, Mitchell, still had his phone. And so the others yelled at him to throw it out the window. And so he did. He chucked his phone out the window. The family drove all day and night until they reached a motel in the New South Wales town of Bathurst, 800 kilometers away to the west of Sydney. The following morning, Mitchell decided he did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so he abandoned his family and began heading home. The remaining 4 family members did not go after Mitchell. Instead, they just piled back in the car and drove east to a popular tourist destination called the Jennylin Caves. It was there that the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, decided that they also did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so they snuck away from their parents and stole a car and began heading home. The parents, after realizing their daughters had now left, did nothing. They did not go after them. The 2 sisters drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they called the police to report their parents missing. The story made its way into the media, where the family was initially ridiculed for getting lost in the first place and getting completely separated in an area they should know well. This is their country. It's not a remote area. They were near big established towns the entire time. It just didn't make sense. But when police went to the Tromp family farm back in Sylvan and they discovered the front door was unlocked, there were credit cards, passports, and phones on the table, suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more to this case than met the eye. And so as this strangeness came into focus in the media, people stopped ridiculing the family and began speculating what caused them to suddenly flee their house. Was it something in the water they were drinking? Was there chemicals on the farm that was screwing up their brain? Were they running from someone? Were they in debt? What was it that caused this strange sudden departure? Back in Goulburn, after reporting their parents missing, Rihanna and Ella inexplicably separated at a gas station. Rihanna just climbed in the back of some utility truck, and Ella hopped in the stolen vehicle and started driving home. Later that night, Ella would become the first Tromp family member to be located by police when she arrived at the farm and police were waiting for her there. Mitchell would arrive back home the following morning after taking a series of trains to get there. Once Mitchell and Ella were reunited, they made a statement to the media outside of the family farm, and as you're looking at them, it's clear they're totally shell-shocked. They don't know what's happened, and they're trying to articulate why their family left in the first place and what they were doing and where they're going, and the best they could do was to say, well, there was a lot of pressure on our family and it was building up, and these things are just difficult to explain, and I don't really know what we were doing. Mitchell would say that there was a belief that people were after them, there was some paranoia there, but that paranoia was predominantly held by their parents. While Mitchell and Ella were certainly in a state of shock, they did seem mentally stable. The same could not be said for their sister, Rihanna. She was discovered by the driver of the truck she had snuck into after he had driven over an hour away. He had pulled over to check on something. He had gone around the back and then had the life scared out of him when he saw Rihanna just sitting there in a what he called catatonic state. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she was just sitting there. Rihanna was taken to the Goulburn Hospital where she was put into their psychiatric unit. As media interest grew, the parents, Mark and Kobe, got back in their car up at the Jennylin Caves and drove south towards Melbourne. A day later, on Wednesday, the pair had driven 600 kilometers to the Victorian town of Wangaratta, where they too inexplicably separated. Kobe turned around and started heading north again by means which are still a mystery, and a day later was found 350 kilometers away in the town of Yas in a very agitated state. She was taken to a hospital there, but then transferred to the Goulburn psychiatric unit to be with her daughter, Rihanna. Mark stayed in Wangaratta, and he was there for several days, and during his time there, he was spotted by a young couple really aggressively tailgating them, and then he was spotted again on another day fleeing from the car he had been driving. Finally, on Saturday evening, all of the Tromp family members were accounted for when Mark was finally discovered sitting next to the road near the Wangaratta airport. He was questioned by police and then assessed by a mental health officer, and then was released into the custody of his brother, who was a police officer. And as they drove away, Mark turned around and flipped off the photographers that had converged on the spot. He later released a more contrite statement apologizing for the hurt and concern that were caused by these events, and he also paid respect to the police and the volunteers that went out looking for them. After the investigation, the police determined that nobody was chasing this family. They were not in any danger. The family had also not taken any drugs. They were not in debt. They were not involved in any sort of religious cult. And prior to this strange event, the family had no history of mental health issues. After the dust had settled and the Tromp family was just back at their farm going about their normal life, every media outlet wanted an interview with them to try to learn more about why this strange thing happened. But the family said, we're not doing interviews, we're not putting out any more statements, we just want to be left alone. And so as a result, all people could do was theorize. And the leading theory was that the Tromp family was suffering from something called folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness for two. And what happens is one person who is delusional can pass that delusion on to other people. And this typically only happens in very close-knit families or in very tight romantic relationships. While it's unclear which of the Tromps became psychotic first, doctors say it is clear at some point they were in a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusions if this folie à deux theory is the right one. While the full reasons for why the Tromps went on this strange voyage will probably never be known, the police deemed it a family matter and did not press charges. In 2007, 35-year-old Eva Wisniewska was a member of the German national paragliding team. Over the previous 2 years, Eva had competed in 10 of the world's biggest paragliding competitions, and she had won 6 of them, making her the top female paraglider in the world. So coming into that year, Eva was very motivated to work extra hard to make sure she retained that title as world champion. On February 24th of that year, Eva was preparing her gear alongside 200 other paragliders on Mount Bora in New South Wales, Australia. This was Eva's last training opportunity before her first major competition of that year, which was scheduled for the next week. As they were getting ready to launch, one of the coaches walked in front of the group and made an announcement. He said storm clouds had been spotted to the north, but the forecast was a little bit ambiguous. It wasn't clear if the storm was going to move over their training area or not. So it was up to each of the paragliders if they still wanted to launch that day and risk the bad weather. Eva, who was really eager to get this training flight in, looked at the sky and saw that it was pretty gray, but decided that she was going to do it. Worst case scenario, she would have to cut it short. The rest of the German national team, they didn't want to take the risk, and so they stayed grounded that day. Eva took a little bit longer preparing her gear, so by the time she was lining up on the cliff, she was only one of a handful of people that remained. And so strapped into her glider, she took a good run forward and launched herself up into the air. On the ground, the rest of the German national team followed in a van to track her progress and checked in with her from time to time with their radio. The first part of Eva's journey was incredibly calm. She followed the ridgeline from Mount Bora for 12 miles until it ended. At that point, she entered into the skies over the vast savanna. As her GPS and tracking log ticked, tracking her progress, 2 large thunderstorm clouds appeared in front of her, one larger than the other. The vast majority of the other paragliders that had launched that day had launched ahead of Eva, and so when these clouds appeared, they had already passed that section, and so they didn't need to contend with the storm. As for Eva and the other 2 people she was with, which was an Austrian team member and a Chinese team member, they had a decision to make. They could either immediately ground their flight to avoid the storm, or they could attempt to dodge it. They chose the latter. They knew it was too dangerous to try to fly underneath these clouds because of something called updraft. At the beginning of storms, warm air is sucked up from the ground up into these clouds, and a paraglider, if they get caught in that, can get sucked up with the air into the storm. And so Ava and the other two paragliders began aggressively flying around the outside of these clouds when all of a sudden the storm completely changed. The big cloud overtook the small cloud, creating this 12-mile wide cumulonimbus cloud that now all three paragliders were stuck inside of. Any updraft is dangerous to a paraglider, but the updraft of a cumulonimbus cloud is famously dangerous because it's extremely powerful and it lasts for over an hour. The Austrian man was able to pull down on one toggle, point his feet, and begin spiraling all the way out of the grasp of this updraft. And he said he turned to look at the other two, and he didn't see the Chinese man, but he did see Ava, and she was desperately trying to do what he was doing and spiral down, but she was clearly caught in the updraft, and he watched her get pulled up into the black cloud out of view. By the time the Austrian man hit the ground, he would say it had become the worst thunderstorm he had ever seen, with huge hail balls hitting the ground all around him. He took one more look up and he didn't see the Chinese man, he didn't see Ava anywhere, and he took off running for a barn to seek shelter. And when he was there, he pulled out his radio and he alerted the other teams of this emergency. Inside the cloud, Ava was hurtling up like a rocket. The storm was lifting her at a rate of 60 feet per second. There was nothing she could do to get out of this wind tunnel. Ava knew she was getting pulled towards the storm's eye in its vicious center because of the immense claps of thunder that just kept getting louder and louder, and it also kept getting darker and darker all around her. In fact, it was pitch black except for the occasional flash of lightning that came very close to electrocuting her. As she desperately tried to keep her glider stable, she was able to place a radio call down to her team on the ground, but all she could say was, "I can't see anything," before it cut out. And at some point, Ava reached the eye of the storm where it's pitch black and the temperatures are freezing and hail balls the size of oranges are pelting her left and right. And the updraft kept pulling her higher and higher and higher until she passed out from a lack of oxygen. And at some point, this updraft actually shot her up and out of the cloud. And while this meant she was out of the storm, she was now in air that was 50 degrees below zero, which meant everything, her face, her gloves, her clothes, the wings of her glider, everything completely froze. And to make matters worse, at the altitude she was at, there was almost no oxygen and she did not have a breathing apparatus. So by all accounts, Ava should be dead. But somehow, she didn't die. She just kept floating around above this storm cloud for 45 minutes. And then something happened. The ice on one side of the glider broke off, causing it to collapse, throwing her into a deadly free fall, and she's not in control, she's still unconscious, and she starts barreling back towards the ground like gravity has been turned back on again, going straight through the storm all over again. And so through the storm, going at 90 feet per second, she clears the storm, and then right after getting out from underneath it, her glider miraculously just opens back up again. And the jerking motion of her suddenly stopping her free fall jolted her awake. And so she's looking around, totally confused as she's gradually regaining consciousness, and she's taking stock of where she is, and she's still in the storm cloud, but right at the bottom of it. But luckily, the updraft had stopped. And so she was steady, and she was able to reach up and grab her toggles, and she was able to fly herself down to the ground and crash land, and then she curled into a ball, grabbed her radio, and she called her team. When they heard her voice, they could not believe she was alive, because the other paraglider that got sucked up by the updraft, the guy from the Chinese national team, he unfortunately was struck by lightning and was killed. And so they were anticipating finding out that Ava had been struck by lightning as well. But Ava had not just survived. When they brought her to the hospital, they discovered that virtually nothing was wrong with her. She had some pretty bad bruises and cuts from the hail, and she had a little bit of frostbite on her face, but it was treatable. And so the same day she was brought in, they discharged her. After leaving the hospital, she and her teammates went back to the launch site so she could collect her gear. And when they got there, she looked at her GPS, and the GPS had been tracking her entire flight the entire time she was up in that cloud. And she showed her teammates what it said, and they literally couldn't believe it. The screen showed she had reached an altitude of 32,634 feet, which, to put this in perspective, is the same altitude you fly at inside of a commercial jet. So imagine being outside of your plane in the middle of a flight, and that's how high she was. Another reference point is she was approximately 4,000 feet higher than the summit of Mount Everest. No human being had ever been that high unprotected and lived to tell the tale. until Ava. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know what it is in the comments and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please remove all of the raisins from the Like Button's raisin brand. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya. There are a handful of images that periodically make the rounds on the internet because they're so shocking and horrible looking that most people assume they are fake, but they're not. Today, I'm going to tell you a wild story that is the background to one of those photos. And then at the end, I will show you this totally bizarre and shocking photo. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please wire the Like Button's bedroom lights to turn on every time the like button gets in bed. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On September 12, 1916, residents of the little mining town called Kingsport, Tennessee, left their homes and packed the main street. Because on this day, a traveling circus called Sparks' World Famous Shows was coming to town. The performers in this traveling circus were going to put on a big parade and then end it with a traditional circus act. This was going to be the most exciting and biggest event that had ever happened in Kingsport. Kingsport was not an affluent place. Most people lived in tents instead of homes, and many of the roads were mud. And so they were really desperate for something fun and exciting to happen. By around noon, all the residents who were lining the main street began hearing the sound of music off in the distance. And then from around the corner came clowns who were banging cymbals and blowing on kazoos. And then there were acrobats and dogs painted different colors. And there were men juggling and walking on stilts and walking upside down. There were horses and lions and trained sea lions. I mean, this parade was a total spectacle, and the residents of Kingsport loved it. They were screaming and cheering with excitement. But the most exciting part of this parade were the elephants. There were 5 of them, and they were at the front of the parade, and they each had their trunks wrapped around the other elephant's tail. So they were walking in a line. And the elephant at the very front of these 5 elephants was very clearly the star of the show. Her name was Mary, and the owner of the circus, whose name was Charlie Sparks, advertised Mary as being the largest living land animal on Earth. She weighed more than 5 tons, which is 10,000 pounds, and Charlie had had her since she was a baby, and he had taught her many tricks. She could stand on her head, she could play 25 songs on a trumpet, and she could throw a baseball. Charlie loved Mary like she was his child, and Charlie knew that Mary was really his ticket to real success. At this time in America, there were lots of other traveling circuses that Charlie had to compete with, and generally speaking, Charlie's circus was on the smaller side. And so this was frustrating for Charlie because he was always trying to find new ways to grow his circus and make it more fun and enjoyable, but a lot of his efforts didn't really work out. However, he at least had Mary, who always seemed to draw a crowd. And when Mary walked down Main Street of Kingsport, everybody was totally amazed by her, and they were totally jealous of the man on her back who got to ride her. It was her handler. His name was Red Edridge. When the parade finally came to an end, and Charlie was getting ready to shift the entire performance from parade to traditional circus act, Red, Mary's handler, took Mary and led her over to a nearby pond to let her get a drink of water. Red, who was 38 years old, was new to elephant handling. In fact, Charlie had hired him just a day earlier when Charlie's show had passed through Virginia, where Red was working as a janitor. Animal handlers in Charlie's show were all trained to treat the animals gently, especially Mary. But Red was a grouchy person who was a very skinny guy with bright red hair, and he had been teased for much of his life, which had kind of made him a mean person. And so as he and Mary are walking over to this pond, Mary saw a watermelon on the ground and stopped to eat it. And as she was doing this, Red noticed there was a group of people kind of forming up around them, just kind of amazed by Mary. And they were noticing that Red was trying to get Mary to go to the pond to get her drink of water, and she wasn't listening. She was focused on the watermelon. And so Red very likely started to feel insecure, that they would think he wasn't in control of the animal. And so he got mad and he took his metal prod and he jabbed it into the side of Mary's head, right behind her ear, breaking her skin. Now, Mary was a very gentle creature, but over the past 24 hours that Red had been her new handler, he had been cruel like this. And so when he poked her with that prod, it was like Mary snapped. Mary dropped the watermelon, turned to face Red, and Red, he's startled by this and just kind of stares up at Mary, wondering what's going on. And Mary would wrap up Red in her long trunk and throw him into a nearby drink stand. At this point, the crowd of children and other people from Kingsport who were watching Mary started to scream and run away. And Mary, she was not done with Red, who was now groaning and rolling over onto his back. Mary walked over to Red, and then she got up on her hind legs and came crashing down directly, all 10,000 pounds of her, onto Red's skull, killing him instantly. Charlie heard all this commotion over near the pond, and he ran over and he found Mary looking totally terrified. And so he began to comfort her, and then he noticed on the ground next to her was Red's mangled body. And around this time, the townspeople who had run in fear had now come back, and they saw what Mary had done. And instead of being scared of Mary, all these townspeople got angry and began screaming at Mary the elephant, "Murderer! Murderer!" Once the news headlines fade about whatever terrible thing happened to them, the victims of violent crime and their families are often left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives all on their own. This is why we started the MrBallen Foundation. It is a registered 501c3 charity whose sole purpose is to help these forgotten people. However, we can't do it alone. Since last year, with your help, we were able to raise and give away to victims of violent crime and their families nearly $500,000. And this year alone, our studio, Ballen Studios, is going to donate $1 million. And to be clear, the MrBallen Foundation does not make a profit. Zero. Meaning 100% of your donations to the foundation go to the cause. Not to overhead, not to salaries, nothing. It's just the cause. So if you're looking for a highly transparent, very active charity that is just trying to do the thing we say we do to support victims of violent crime and their families, then look no further than the MrBallen Foundation. To make a donation, simply go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Donate. Again, that's MrBallen.Foundation and click Donate. This was, of course, a worst-case scenario for Charlie, just from a business perspective, because Mary was the star of his show, and she had just very publicly killed her handler. In the hours after Red's death, news of murderous Mary began spreading around town and to other towns nearby, and before long there was a mob of people trying to kill Mary who had to be held back, and then also the sheriff of Kingsport at some point came up to Mary and fired his gun at her, but Mary was so big and her skin was so tough, the bullets did not penetrate. Also, within hours of Red being killed, the town that Charlie and his circus were supposed to go to next sent word that they were not allowed to come if Mary was going to be with them. Charlie knew that at this point, even though Mary had been the star of his show, that if he didn't get rid of her, he would be out of business. He'd be financially ruined. However, he loved Mary. She was his oldest and most loyal partner, and he couldn't imagine giving her up. But Charlie was also very ambitious, and he had a whole crew of people in his circus that depended on doing these shows to make a living. And so, on the night of Red's death, Charlie would lay awake all night just thinking about what he was going to do. And by early the next morning, Charlie had come up with a plan. Charlie ordered his entire circus to pack up and get back on the train. They were going to head to the next town called Irwin. And Charlie said, once they got there, they would put on a show that no one in the world had ever seen before. Sparks' world-famous shows arrived in Irwin at about 10 a.m. that day, and immediately all the performers began setting up for this big show, which again would start with a parade, followed by a circus act, and then a grand finale. Now, Irwin was already packed by the time the circus actually arrived, because news of what Charlie had planned for this grand finale had reached Irwin and the surrounding towns, and so everybody had flooded this town to see it. At midday, Charlie's team was ready, and they began the parade, but Mary was not a part of the parade. Instead, she was chained up inside of the main circus area where the circus act would take place after the parade ended. And when the parade ended, it put on the circus act right around Mary, but Mary was not unchained. She was left in the middle of the circus, just kind of standing there, not sure what to do. She kind of swayed around with the music and trumpeted a few times, but she was confused and no one really knew what she was doing there. And then finally, the main circus act came to an end, and most of the performers went back into their tents. And at this point, all of the crowd who had been watching this circus began making their way over to the railroad yard. At the same time, Charlie and several of the animal handlers came out and grabbed the 4 other elephants who were not chained up, and they went over to Mary and they unchained her, and then they formed all the elephants up in a line, with each of the trunks connected to the tail of the next elephant. And they marched all 5 elephants over to the railroad yard, where now there was a massive crowd that also included the press, who had shown up with their cameras ready to capture the grand finale. Charlie led Mary and the other 4 elephants onto the railroad tracks, which were up on this embankment, and once they got up there, Charlie halted the other 4 elephants and sent them away with their handlers and left Mary all alone on the railroad tracks. And at this point, as Charlie is consoling her, one of the circus performers came over and chained Mary's back legs to the railroad tracks. Now, Mary was extremely well trained, and Charlie is right there comforting her. And so even though she was nervous as she was getting chained up, she didn't try to fight it. And as this was happening, a railroad worker climbed into a machine called a derrick, which is basically a big crane that's able to lift heavy things like lumber off of the railroad cars. And so this worker hops in the derrick, which is on tracks, and he brought it over right behind Mary. And so once the derrick was in place, and once Mary was securely fastened to the tracks, another worker climbed up onto the crane of the derrick, so the actual arm that was jutting out over Mary. This worker climbed up on top of it, and he grabbed the chain that was dangling off of it, and he jumped onto Mary's back, carrying this chain, and he looped it around Mary's neck and secured it, and then jumped off of Mary. At this point, Charlie, who was still holding on to Mary's trunk and comforting her, gave her one last embrace, and then turned away from her and walked down the embankment toward the huge crowd, who had now gone totally silent, sensing the grand finale was about to start. Once Charlie reached the crowd, he turned around to face Mary. He signaled the railroad worker in the derrick, who then pulled a lever inside of the derrick. At this point, the only sound that could be heard across the whole railroad yard was the sound of this chain that had just been activated slowly being retracted by the derrick. And so as it was pulling Mary up off the ground by her neck. And so as it tightened around Mary's neck, and she realized she couldn't go anywhere because she's anchored to the tracks by her back legs, she began to panic, and she kept looking over at Charlie and trumpeting, trying to get someone to help her, but no help came. And eventually the derrick tightened so much that it lifted Mary's front legs off the ground, and her back legs were still on the ground. And so with one last look over at Charlie, she let out a trumpeting call, and then her back legs left the ground and she went silent. And she was hung there until she died. Mary's public execution was Charlie's big grand finale to this show. He had killed off this murderous elephant in an effort to appease the masses and save his circus business. And it did work. His circus continued to grow for a number of years. I mean, lots of people were interested in coming to see whatever he was doing because of the infamy around Mary. But after killing Mary, Charlie was never the same. He would actually retire early and then die in 1944. Today, Erwin, Tennessee is still known as the town that hung the elephant. So that's going to do it. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast. We have over 100 episodes. Many of them are exclusive to the podcast, so you can't get them on YouTube. The podcast is just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. There are some people that everyone should know about, and one of those people is Jack Churchill. But before we get into Jack's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come out with you for a nice casual get-together, and when you're about halfway through dinner, start aggressively hard-selling your multi-level marketing scheme. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 1926, Jack Churchill graduated from one of the UK's most prestigious military academies called Sandhurst, thus becoming an army officer. His first assignment was to an infantry unit stationed in Burma, but when he got there, it was peacetime, so Jack didn't have much to do. But instead of just sitting around all day, Jack did what any other restless young military officer would do, and he mastered the bagpipes, despite being 0% Scottish. He also took a trip across the entire Indian subcontinent on his motorcycle, almost entirely on unpaved roads. But in 1936, despite these incredible side hobbies, he just wasn't really that interested in being a part of the military when there wasn't anything going on, and so he decided to get out. He moved to Nairobi, Kenya, where he became a newspaper editor / male model / movie extra. During his off time, he still took his bagpiping very seriously, placing second in a prominent piping competition in 1938. He also picked up another hobby, archery, and he became so good at it so quickly that he was chosen by England to represent them in the Archery World Championships in 1939. Later that same year, when World War II broke out, Jack decided now's a good time to get back into the army. So he rejoined the army and he was promptly sent to France to help defend their borders against a potential Nazi invasion. But shortly after Jack arrived, Hitler was able to push through those defenses and he launched a brutal blitzkrieg campaign against the Allies in France. Blitzkrieg is a military tactic that's basically an all-out attack all at once with everything you got. So planes, tanks, artillery, infantry, you just send all of it in an attempt to overwhelm your enemy before you run out of resources. And in this case, Hitler's blitzkrieg was successful. In just 6 weeks, they not only invaded France, they conquered it. But during that 6-week battle for France that the Allies ultimately lost, Jack made a name for himself by employing 2 particular weapons that nobody else in World War II was using. He is the only one who used these weapons for the entirety of World War II. Jack and 2 other infantrymen were up on this hill overlooking this town that was full of Nazis, and at some point 5 Nazis come running out to the edge of this town and they duck behind a wall that's about 30 meters away from Jack. And one of these Nazis stands up and quickly crumples to the ground. And his 4 Nazi comrades look to see what happened to him, and they see a dead man on the ground with the back end of an arrow jutting out of his chest. And that arrow was fired by none other than Jack Churchill. Because for the duration of World War II, he didn't carry a gun. He didn't need a gun. Instead, he carried a bow and arrow and a long broadsword. Although periodically he would scoop the weapons up off of dead enemy soldiers, and he would fire those. When asked why he didn't just carry a gun in the first place, he responded, "Any officer that goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." From then on, he became Mad Jack, and his peers loved him. But his leadership hated him. They said he was setting a terrible example, that no one should be running around with a sword and a bow and arrow. But he was so effective, they let him continue. Throughout the brutal 6-week battle for France, Jack would lead dozens of these small raids against the Nazis, and he would just pick them off one by one with his bow and arrow and with his sword. And in one particular raid, he got shot through the neck, but he was so nonchalant about it that when he got back to base, someone was like, "Hey, Jack, you're bleeding." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, I am." They were like, "Well, what happened?" He's like, machine gun. After the Allies finally lost this battle for France and were forced to evacuate, they found a diary from one of the British soldiers, and in it he talks about the one thing that motivated him and the other troops around him, and that was the sight of Mad Jack running hither and thither with his bow and arrow and his broadsword. For his bravery in France, Jack was awarded the Military Cross. After leaving France, Jack heard about this new unit, the Commandos, that was being stood up to aggressively sabotage Nazi operations, and they were looking for volunteers. And Jack didn't know much about what they were going to do, but they promised combat, and so he was all for it, and he volunteered. The commando unit would go on to become the famous British Special Forces, and the training they put Jack and the other volunteers through was absolutely brutal. And Jack just loved it. He loved being in the Commandos. After graduation in 1941, Jack was put in command of a commando unit that was tasked with going to this Norwegian town of Vågsøy and taking down a Nazi garrison there. And so they loaded up into their amphibious landing craft, and Jack's got his kilt on, and he's got his bagpipes, and he plays the bagpipes on the entire transit over to Vågsøy to pump up the commandos. And then Jack's landing craft was the first to reach the shores, and when its ramp came down, Jack was the first off, and he just kept playing his bagpipes, despite the fact that the Nazis now see them, and they're shooting at them. So rounds are impacting around him as he's blaring his bagpipes, and only when he finished his song did he shoulder his bagpipes, pull out a grenade. He saw some Nazis running along the ridgeline. He throws a grenade at them and pulls out his sword and runs into battle. In just a few hours, the Nazi garrison had fallen, and Jack was awarded his second Military Cross. During the Italian amphibious landings in 1943, Jack again was in charge of a commando unit, and they were tasked with capturing a Nazi observation post that was in this town just outside of Salerno. It was well defended and fortified, and Jack and his men were outnumbered 20-1. So Jack came up with a genius plan. Instead of using stealth tactics, he broke his small team into 6 different groups, and he placed them all around the outside of this town. And it was nighttime, so the Nazis did not see them setting up. And then on Jack's call, he had them all yell out at the exact same time, "Commando!" And the Nazis in the town were so caught off guard by all this yelling coming from all around them, they assumed a huge force is coming to take over this town. And so they went on the defensive. And so after their big war cry, Jack and his group are the first to charge down into this town, and Jack and one other guy would actually splinter off, and they would discover this big group of Nazis that were setting up their mortars. And so Jack and this guy sneak up behind one of them, and Jack grabs him from behind, holds this sword to his throat, and orders him to tell the rest of the team to surrender. And so the rest of the team, who vastly outnumber Jack and the other guy, they turn around and they see this lunatic wearing a kilt, wielding a sword. He's got bagpipes slung over his shoulder along with a bow and arrow, and they're like, "Okay, we give up." Shortly after, the rest of the Nazis in this town would surrender to Jack and his men, and for his actions, Jack would be awarded the Distinguished Service Order. In 1944, Jack was in Yugoslavia with the Commandos trying to capture a strategically valuable location called Point 62. And when every man in his team was either killed or severely wounded, and when Jack had run out of arrows, instead of surrendering, he pulled out his bagpipes and started playing until a grenade detonated behind him, knocking him unconscious. The Nazis captured him and sent him to Berlin to be interrogated because they believed, because of his last name, Churchill, that he was connected to or related to the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He wasn't, not at all, so they ordered Jack to be sent to a concentration camp. On his way out of Berlin, Jack secretly flicked a lit cigarette butt into one of his interrogators' offices, and he lit it on fire, but nobody knew it was him. And so Jack arrives at this concentration camp, and he's only there for a couple of months before he and another British military officer managed to escape by crawling underneath one of the barbed wire fences. They had slowly burrowed a tunnel without anybody noticing, and then they jumped down into this abandoned drainage pipe, and they crawled out to freedom that way. But their freedom would be short-lived because they only made it a couple of miles before they were recaptured by the Nazis. And so they were ordered to go to another concentration camp that was considered much more secure. But after only having been at this new concentration camp for less than a year, once again, Jack was able to escape. This time it was because there was a power outage at the camp, and Jack just put his shovel down and casually walked out the front gates and nobody noticed. He walked 150 miles in the treacherous terrain of the Alps, surviving on vegetables he had stolen from people's gardens, and then finally 8 days later he came across a United States Armored Division, and they took him in and reconnected him with British troops, and then he was ultimately sent back to England. And while Jack was free, he was very frustrated that the war in Europe was effectively over and he had missed most of it. And so he requested a transfer to go out to Burma to fight against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater, but as soon as he got there, the Americans had just dropped the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan, abruptly ending World War II. And when Jack heard about this, he was so disappointed he would not get to do any more fighting. He was quoted as saying, if it wasn't for those Yanks, we could have kept this war going for another 10 years. Even though the war was over, Jack desperately wanted to get into combat at least one more time, and so he went to jump school and qualified as a parachutist at the age of 40, and with this new qualification, he was assigned to a light infantry unit, and they were deployed to Palestine to train their army how to better fight the Arab forces. And while he was there, he gained even more fame when he defended a Jewish medical convoy from an Arab ambush. And he did this all while wearing a kilt. Another time, he and 12 of his men helped evacuate 700 people from a Jewish hospital that was under attack from Arab forces. After Palestine, Jack came back to England and eventually retired from the army, and then begrudgingly took a desk job within the Ministry of Defense. And every day on his commute home on the train, he would take his briefcase and throw it out the window as they were moving. What he had figured out was if he threw it at the exact right moment, it would land in the backyard of his house, and he wouldn't need to carry his briefcase from the station to his house. But he didn't explain that to any of the other passengers on the train. They just figured there's some crazy guy who keeps throwing his briefcases out the window. In his retirement, he also became an extremely talented surfer. And at one point, he wanted to surf the Severn Bore, which is this huge wave in southwestern England that nobody else had surfed before. And locals that were familiar with this treacherous wave, they cautioned him and said, you really shouldn't do this. And he looked at them and he just said, I'll be all right. And then he proceeded to be the first person ever to successfully ride that wave. Jack would ultimately die in 1996. He was 89 years old. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come out with you for a very casual get-together. And when you're about halfway through dinner, start aggressively hard selling your multi-level marketing scheme. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See you.
So tonight I have 2 stories to tell you, and they're great stories, but when I was thinking about how I would go about teasing the stories like I do at the top of these episodes, I couldn't quite think of sort of what the connective tissue was between them. But then I realized really what makes these stories exceptional is that they're both just excellent stories, as I'm getting hit by the heat of this fire, to be told around a campfire. But before we get into those 2 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, go ahead and invite the like button to come to your campfire and cook some s'mores with you. But give them the wrong date and location. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. In the late 1990s, in rural New York, there were these two teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were both very good friends. They were part of a bigger group of friends in their high school that sort of spent a lot of time together, but Rachel and Molly oftentimes were together by themselves quite a bit. And the thing that sort of drew the two together and really sort of made them friends in the first place and also drew them to that bigger group was their shared love of goth culture. So being goth, especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, if you were like a high school kid, basically meant you wore all black clothes, you had like black, nail polish, black lipstick, your hair's black, you sort of embraced all things dark and macabre. Some people were genuinely very into sort of like the idea of embracing the dark side of things. Other people just did it as like a fashion statement. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was definitely a thing, certainly in America. And Rachel and Molly were both very committed goths, and they just sort of loved that whole vibe. And one of the things that Rachel and Molly really liked to do as goth teenagers is they and their group of friends would go hang out in the local cemetery. Now, at first, the reason they did this was actually to sort of be ironic. It's like they were known as the goth kids in their high school, and so the idea of them hanging out in a cemetery just seemed kind of too on the nose. And so they went out there almost like a joke, the whole group of them. But they found the cemetery was kind of a cool hangout spot, and they began to really enjoy hanging out in the cemetery, and it became sort of like their go-to thing, especially on the weekends. Now, typically, when Rachel, Molly, and their friends would go hang out in the cemetery, they would do so at night to sort of maximize, the darkness, really leaning into the whole goth side of things. But also, they would always go as a group. Like it was Rachel, Molly, and several other people that would be in the cemetery hanging out at one time. Like Rachel and Molly did not go there just the two of them. It was always a group. And part of the reason was it was just more enjoyable that way. But also, despite their love of spending time in the cemetery, it was still a cemetery at night, and it was, a little bit creepy. And so there was, strength in numbers, and so they liked being there with a group. It felt safer. One Friday night, Rachel was home alone when she got a call from Molly. And Molly asked her, hey, do you want to go hang out in the cemetery? And Rachel's like, duh, like, that's what we do on the weekends. I'd love to go. Like, come pick me up. Let's go. And so Rachel, she gets all ready and, she's waiting outside. And eventually Molly shows up in her car. And the first thing Rachel notices is that Molly's all alone in the car. She is not with the group that normally she would be with when they picked Rachel up. So Rachel, she walks out to the car and she climbs in and she says to Molly, like, hey, so are we now going to pick up the rest of our friends? Like, where is everybody? And Molly's like, actually, no, I tried getting in touch with everybody else, but everybody's either busy or working or hungover from last night. So it's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Like, is that okay? And Rachel admittedly did not think this was okay. Because again, like this was not an activity that these girls did by themselves. Rachel was very close with Molly and vice versa. Like that was fine. It's a little uncomfortable being in the cemetery without the big group. But, Rachel didn't want to be rude. She sort of felt like Molly had already clearly made peace with them being alone out there. And so Rachel's like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, it'll be great, just the two of us. Like, let's go. And so even though she sort of didn't want to, she gets in the car and they take off and they drive, the half mile to the cemetery. Now, this cemetery was enormous. It was like this massive, very old cemetery. And when you pull up to it, as they did in their car, you would first see this huge, like medieval gate, like this archway that sort of goes across the entrance to the cemetery. And like the big wrought iron gates, they're sort of permanently open, but it's this very like sort of Gothic looking, archway that you drive through. And then once you're in the cemetery, the road you're on basically cuts down the very middle of the cemetery all the way to the backside. It's a huge, probably like over a mile from one side to the other. And it sort of split the cemetery into two big parts, the right and the left side as you go in. And where they, Molly, Rachel, and their friends loved to hang out was sort of, as you're driving into the cemetery, like the back left corner. And the reason they liked that area is because on the left side of the cemetery, sort of on the left-hand side, there were sort of like rolling hills that all the plots were in. And in particular, in the back left corner of the cemetery, there was like this one depression in the earth where there really weren't that many tombstones. And there was like a big boulder sitting at the bottom of the depression and a tree that was next to it. And so basically, if you were scanning across the top of the cemetery, just from the gate, looking out at the entire expanse of land, anybody that was down in that sort of depressed area in the back left corner, you basically couldn't see them. They're sort of tucked away down there with the rock and the tree. And so for, teenagers, for Rachel, Molly, and their friends, that was like a great place to hang out and kind of be away from the prying eyes of the public. And so, Rachel and Molly, they drive through this gate and they make the familiar drive right down the middle of this road all the way to the very back of the cemetery. By this point, it is getting dark outside. It's not totally dark yet, but it's pretty dark. Nobody's out at the cemetery. No one really ever was. Occasionally on the other side of the cemetery, basically on the exact opposite side from where they would hang out, sometimes the college kids that were in town, there was a university in their town, they would sometimes hop the fence on the other side, and there was like a little bonfire section, like right up against the fence in the cemetery. Totally not allowed, but they would sneak over and do that sometimes. But that was sort of rare. But other than those occasional college students over there, the cemetery was basically always vacant. And so they get to the other side, they park their car, they get out, and they walk right from the road, basically right down this it's a gentle sloping hill, but down into this depression, their hangout spot. And once they get down there, there's that big rock and the tree, and they each took up positions sitting on the rock, leaning against the tree, and then just began crushing cigarettes and just hanging out, because that's what goth teenagers in rural New York in the 1990s did. So Rachel and Molly, they're doing their thing, they're having a nice time, they're swapping stories, they're talking about their boyfriends, about drama at school. And eventually, it gets fully dark outside, and the girls are still just having a nice time, and Rachel's actually thinking to herself, like, actually, this is kind of nice. Like, this isn't scary. This is kind of cool. Like, I'm having, good one-on-one time with my buddy here. But eventually, as they're down there, they start to smell smoke. Now, remember, periodically, on the other side of the cemetery, like pretty far away, was that bonfire area that college kids sometimes would, start bonfires over there. And, when Rachel and Molly had first come into the cemetery, they had looked over there and hadn't seen a fire. But they're thinking, we've been hanging out here for quite a while. It's entirely possible that in the time we've been down here, that those kids have hopped the fence, started a fire, and that's what we're smelling. Now, the fire itself really had no bearing directly on whatever Molly and Rachel were going to do that night. I mean, they're on opposite sides of the cemetery. But Rachel and Molly knew that historically, whenever there was a bonfire over there, eventually the police would always show up, because you're not allowed to do that. And they would kick off, the kids, they'd make them put their fire out. And then always the police would do, a check of the entire cemetery. And anybody that was hanging out in there, like Molly and Rachel were, also got kicked out, even if they were not starting fires. And so Molly and Rachel, they look at each other after smelling this fire, and they both sort of have the same thought, like, we should probably just leave, before the police get here and make us leave. And, after all, they'd been there for quite a while. They were about ready to leave anyhow, so this was like no big deal. So, they put out their last cigarette, they got their stuff, and they turned and began walking back up the hill, back in the direction they had come down on, back in the direction of their car. And as they're walking up, they're expecting to crest the hill and, see their car and see the whole cemetery, and, maybe way off in the distance, maybe they'll see a flicker of the bonfire that they must be smelling. But as they walk up and they see their car and they look out across the cemetery, they don't see a fire over there. Instead, basically right over to their right, like, 100 meters away from them, was another sort of depression in the cemetery, another rolling hill that sort of went down out of sight. And they could see basically the tops of a flickering fire, like in the neighboring depression, like 100 meters away. Now, when they showed up, they were definitely alone on this side of the cemetery. There was nobody else here. And so clearly someone has shown up and started a fire while they were here. And they've never seen any behavior like this. This is like completely unusual. Like, no one starts fires over here. Like, what is that? So the two girls they're curious, like, did the college kids come over here to start a fire? Because again, they can only see the tops of the flames of this fire down in this neighboring depression. They can't see the person or people who are around it, but they're thinking like, the people over there have no idea that we are over here. And so the two girls are like, well, what if we kind of go back down to where we were and sneak up the far side of our sort of hilled in area and poke our heads over and like see whose fire this is? We'll see the college kids and see what they're doing. We can like spy on them or something. And the two girls are like, yeah, why not? We're already here. And so the two girls, they turn around, they walk back down into the base of their depression where the big rock and the tree was that they were just sitting on for the past couple of hours. And they walk past it basically to the other side and begin walking up that hill. And as they're getting closer and closer to the top of this hill, when eventually, once they reach the top, they could peer over and see the fire and see whoever was there. Right as they got almost to the top, Rachel sort of unintentionally makes some noise, like the way she was walking, and she sort of made a sound as she stepped on something, but she accidentally makes a fair amount of noise. And the only noise in the area was the sound of the fire. Like they hadn't heard any voices yet. And so Rachel, she just covers her mouth and looks over at Molly, and Molly kind of looked at her like, what are you doing? Like, we're sneaking up on these people. Like, why are you making noise? And the two girls, they just freeze for a second, waiting to see if, whoever was over there heard them and sort of reacted to the noise Rachel made. But it was silent, sort of eerily silent. And at this point, Rachel and Molly, it was like the mood just shifted. Like they had not reached the top of the hill yet. They had not seen whoever was at this fire. But it was like something just felt wrong now. And the two girls looked at each other and they're like, maybe we should just turn around and leave. And they both were like, yeah, let's get out of here. Like, this doesn't feel right. And so right then and there, the two girls, as quietly as they could, turned and retreated back down to the center of the depression where the rock and the tree was, and they begin walking back up the original side of the hill in the direction of where their car is parked at the top. And as they're walking up, Rachel just happens to turn back around where they had just been, just to look in the direction of where they had just been. And now she sees there is clearly a man standing on the ridgeline with the fire behind him illuminating him, and he's just standing there sort of ominously staring in the direction of Rachel and Molly. And he's just not saying a word, he's just looking in their direction. Clearly he was the one over at the fire, he must have heard them. And Rachel, she whips around and she's like, Molly, look. And Molly looks and she's like, let's get out of here. We don't know who that guy is, like we gotta get out of here. And so Rachel and Molly, they begin quickly walking up the hill. And then a second later, Rachel turns back around and the man is no longer on the hill, but then she sees movement and she realizes he's running down the hill in their direction. And so the girls start screaming, they start running up the hill. Rachel's constantly looking around and this guy's gaining on them. They get to the top of the hill, they charge over to Molly's car, they jump inside, they lock the doors, they fire it up and they drive off. And as they're driving, Rachel's looking out the back window and she sees this man basically looking. He's reached the road, like he almost got to them. And he was looking in their direction. And as they drove off, he just slowly turned and walked back down the hill out of sight. And so Rachel and Molly, they're like totally shaken up by this. Like clearly that wasn't a college kid. Like that was a 40-something-year-old man who they had never seen before. Like the whole situation just felt totally just creepy and spooky, and they really didn't know what to make of it. They sort of felt like what could have happened if he reached us? Like what was he trying to do? Like what just happened? But ultimately, when they got home, or when Molly dropped Rachel off at her house, the two girls were sort of like, man, that was crazy, huh? They kind of like chalked it up as like just a crazy night, like, oh boy, we better, stay out of there alone at night, like it was just sort of a joke by the time they were done for the night. And so Rachel, she goes into her house, doesn't even tell her mom. She just, puts her stuff down, goes to her room, and Molly, she went to her house, and she too didn't even tell anyone. She went to bed as well. The next morning, Rachel woke up and she went downstairs into the kitchen, and her mom was in there. And her mom was just kind of doing her morning routine, and when she saw Rachel come in, she said to Rachel, like, hey, how was your night last night? And Rachel was like, oh, it was fine. Me and Molly went out. It was fine. No big deal. And her mom was like, oh, did you hear what happened last night? And Rachel's like, no, what do you mean? What happened? And her mom was like, well, a woman in our town got kidnapped. And she got kidnapped from the very parking garage where I park. Like she worked in the same building as me. She got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, like, what happened to her? Like, did they find her? And Rachel's mom is like, no. Unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And in fact, whoever kidnapped and then killed her brought her body last night to the local cemetery and burned her in this huge bonfire. And whoever did it still hasn't been caught. And when Rachel heard this, it was like her whole world came crashing down, because suddenly she understood what had happened the night before. That fire was no ordinary fire. That was the killer that chased them down the hill. That fire very likely contained the woman who had been killed. They were right next to this person, this killer, and this horrible thing happening. And even more creepy is like, they were there very likely when the killer arrived, set up shop, and began burning this body, no more than 100 meters away from them. And what would have happened if that man who chased them, what would have happened if he caught them? And so Rachel, she pours her heart out to her mom and tells her everything that happened the night before. And her mom is like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened. You have to tell the police because they haven't caught this guy. Like, you have a description of him. Like, go talk to the police. And so sure enough, Rachel, she gets in touch with Molly and, tells Molly what happened. And Molly's totally in hysterics. They can't believe what a close call this was. And they do go to the police. They tell them, to the best of their ability, what they remember about this guy, which unfortunately was not much. It was like he was average height, he looked to be maybe in his 40s. Like, there wasn't much to their description. But fortunately, just 48 hours later, the police were able to catch this guy and he would make a full confession. Luckily, 2 days later, not really because of the girl's description at all, but just sort of by luck alone, the police happened to see the victim's car in town. Somebody was driving the victim's car around, and so they pulled this person over. It wound up being the killer who, after being arrested, did make a full confession. And so, needless to say, Rachel and Molly, when they think about what happened that night in the cemetery, they feel very fortunate that Rachel sort of inadvertently made noise on their approach to go spy on the fire, which ultimately caused them both to sort of rethink their decisions and turn around and leave. It very likely saved their life. Because if that hadn't happened and they had gone over the hill and had been confronted by the killer, it's entirely possible that both those girls could have wound up in the bonfire as well. So before I became MrBallen and, told stories on the internet, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, I was in the military. I was a Navy SEAL for 7 years. And there was a time where I believed that was going to be my calling in life. But I ultimately got hurt, and honestly, it wasn't really a fit. So I wound up departing, and then obviously the rest is history. I became MrBallen. But, I have lots of stories about my time when I was in the military. I have lots of really funny stories about training and scary stories, about my actual service overseas. But one story that has always stood out to me was actually what it was like to deploy for the very first time to Afghanistan. And this is not really a war story, and that's why this story sort of stands out to me. I spend years, literally almost 3 years training and becoming a Navy SEAL. And then it's like, okay, I get to my SEAL team on the East Coast in Virginia. And, so SEAL Team 2 is where I was. And we start training for our deployment, and we find out it's going to be to Afghanistan. And, this is back in 2013. And so, going to Afghanistan likely meant combat. In that time, there was still definitely active combat operations happening. And for Navy SEALs and for any direct combat unit, you do want to go to war, not because you are like a warmonger, but because that's what you train for. And so it's like, okay, like I'm getting ready for combat. And then the day comes, and the way you deploy this is not unique to Navy SEALs, but like they don't send you out to wherever you're going in one group because it's sort of risky. What if a plane crashes and your whole platoon gets wiped out, right? So you get sent out in like little batches, like sometimes on civilian flights. Like I flew first to South America with like a couple other SEALs. We're all dressed as civilians. And then we hitched a military transit flight actually into Afghanistan. But again, like my mentality as I'm getting ready for this deployment is like, okay, like this is the thing I've trained for. Like, here we go, like combat. And I remember I was on this military plane. This is the last leg actually getting into Afghanistan. And when we actually flew into Afghani airspace, which is an active war zone at the time, the pilots, the military pilots, they turned the lights inside of the aircraft from the white overhead, like, daytime lights to red. And then they told all of us to stay away from the windows. And the reason was, like, we're now entering, the part of this trip where we're going to land. And in theory, the plane could get shot at. You don't want to get shot at through the window. And I mean, if you think about it, if you're getting blasted by like an RPG, it's not going to matter that like you're near a window or not. But it was sort of this stark reminder that it's like, okay, here we go. Like, we're about to enter a war zone. And then the way these planes would land is they needed to basically cut down the amount of time they were within small arms range. So the lower you get, the more, sort of exposed the plane is. And so the way they'd land is they would take these really steep descents and basically like fly straight down and then land really abruptly. It was like sort of gnarly. And so we're coming in for this crazy landing. The red lights are on. Everyone's tucked away from the windows. And I'm like, okay, we're getting ready for Afghanistan. And we touch down. And it's a successful landing, and now we're in this like pretty well fortified base. Shank is what it was called. And I remember the back of the plane opened up after we sort of had stopped taxiing. We came to a stop, and the back of the plane opened up. And remember, my mentality is like, okay, we're going to war, right? And I grabbed my pack. The rest of my stuff had been packed on pallets and sent weeks prior. So all I have is a backpack. And me and a buddy of mine, another guy on my team, we walk out the runway, and we basically see Afghanistan really for the first time, because I really had the windows on the airplane, by the way, were like these little portholes. You really never got a good look, not to mention we had to avoid the windows. So this is like my first view of Afghanistan. And I remember just like looking around, and it was just unbelievably beautiful. Like, Afghanistan is shockingly beautiful. It's in every direction, 360 degrees, these just enormous, like massive snow-covered mountains and just beautiful fields. It's like untouched land. And like, we're in the middle of this like jagged scar across the earth, which is this like NATO base where war is sort of launched out of. But it's like you're looking around at just this unbelievably beautiful place. And it was like in such contrast to what I believed I was coming here for, or what I was there for, like to fight in a war. And it just like didn't compute. Like, this is too beautiful a place to be having a war fought. But I mean, very quickly after sort of seeing this environment and being like, oh my gosh, we were quickly ushered over to this like holding area, and we had to grab our stuff. And then before long, we had jumped into these very up-armored military vehicles called RGs, which are like 50,000 ton anti-IED vehicles. Basically, if it detonates underneath you, in theory, you'll survive. And out we go, from the base we were on out to this like very forward operating base that was sort of out in the sticks. And it was like sort of a vulnerable spot. And it was where we were going to be operating from for the next 6 months. Our mission was pretty vulnerable. We were out sort of actually actively fighting the war. But that first night, we get to our actual base, this very stripped down, like very vulnerable spot out in the middle of nowhere. And when we got there, there were the previous team was still there. They were wrapping up their deployment. And there were interpreters who are a central part of the warfighting effort, from our side. And a lot of these interpreters who are pretty young, like in their 20s, like they've been out there working with various units that have come through those bases for years. And because they're working with NATO, they don't have a place outside of the base. Like, they're targeted by the Taliban and other sort of militant groups because, they're working for NATO. They're traitors, And so the great promise for these interpreters is that by working with NATO, eventually they'll be given the opportunity to leave Afghanistan and come to the United States. And for some people, that's true. Not true for everybody. But these interpreters are like hard as nails. They've been in so many gunfights. Like, these people have seen some crazy stuff. And my role was to work with these interpreters. I was going to be someone that worked with our partner force. And so I get to this little outstation. It's late at night, and it's sort of overwhelming, this whole thing. The team that was already there, SEAL Team 8, they were like so like cowboy by this point. They'd been in combat now for the last 6 months. They're all just like jacked and huge beards. Like, they could care less about anything. and I'm like super green. And I went and I met with one of our interpreters to like sort of give me a lay of the land of what to expect over the next couple of days. And so we talked about some operations we'd likely do and sort of, got to know each other a little bit. But at some point, one of these interpreters, the guy I was talking to, who maybe was like 25, 26, and I was in my 20s too, he said to me, he goes, bro, and they all talk in like Western slang. Like their English is like rugged, like American military slang, because they're around like 18-year-old Marines 24/7. He's like, bro, have you heard the story of what was in the cave in Kandahar? Now, we were in a different part of Afghanistan, but he was referencing Kandahar, Afghanistan. And what I would come to find out is there was this story about a giant, like a creature, some huge creature that lived in a cave out in the mountains of Kandahar. And like Afghanistan, again, is this huge, just like mountains everywhere. And there are all these cave systems up in these mountains, some of which are like untouched by humanity. And this Terp was like, bro, I'm telling you, it's real. Like there was a giant up in the caves in Kandahar. Like, have you heard about this? Like, I want to know more. The interpreter did. And so, we didn't really talk much more than that, but it was planted in my mind that there was like this real belief by this interpreter that there was like some truth to this, what sounded like sort of a folklore, this crazy story about a giant in a cave. And so it stuck with me. It stuck with me that I'd heard that story. Fast forward, years later, I'm out of the military, and I've become MrBallen. I've begun telling strange, dark, and mysterious stories on the internet. And I was thinking about what stories I wanted to tell. This was like in the very early days of having the channel. And I suddenly remembered like the Kandahar giant. And I was like, man, I want to look into that and see if there's any truth to what my interpreter was getting at. And sure enough, I found like this treasure trove of testimony from this special operations group, the Green Berets, that apparently did. Like this one particular group of Green Berets that apparently came in touch with something otherworldly up in the caves of Kandahar. And in particular, there was one soldier who just went by Mr. K because he was worried about his name getting out there, who gave just like shocking testimony about what they saw. And so I felt like I needed to do this story justice. I wanted to sort of compile the notes and put together a story that, sort of picked up where my interpreter had began. And I told the story years and years ago. And tonight, I'm going to tell you that story again. So in 2002, there was this Army infantry unit that was out doing a patrol in the Kandahar mountain range. And again, you got to picture just massive snow-covered mountains. I mean, this is a huge area. And, a lot of times in 2002, these patrols, you'd be sort of looking potentially for cave systems where Taliban fighters would be camping out, or, sometimes there'd be fighters that were down in the valleys below. But these patrols were fairly routine for NATO in 2002. And so this unit, they're out on patrol, and generally the way it works, really independent of what branch of the military you're in the US military, when you're out on patrol, you basically update some level of higher command as you're doing the operation. And also, by the way, virtually no operations, no matter how routine or mundane, like no operations aren't planned out. Like everything is planned. Like what time you get there, how long you're going to be there, what you're trying to do, when you're going to leave, what platform you're going to use to leave. Like everything is really coordinated. And so this unit, they went out, for the umpteenth time to do this patrol. And at some point in the middle of this patrol, the higher command lost contact with them. And the reason this immediately stood out as problematic is, it wasn't totally unusual for a group to lose comms. I mean, you're trying to communicate across huge mountain ranges, using, these radios that are really a lot of times not that great. And so losing comms is not that unusual. But generally speaking, like a lot of times if you lose comms, you get it back pretty quickly. And so there had been a pretty long period of time where no one could get in touch with this unit. And then on top of that, as higher command was beginning to figure out like what we should do here, should we send out a quick reaction force to go find them? Should we send, air assets overhead to go try to look for them that way? As they're thinking about that, somebody realized that not only had they suddenly gone silent, this huge infantry unit, but also they had not called in a tick before they went silent. So a tick, or troops in contact is the acronym for basically being in a gunfight. And the reason this is important is, when you're in a combat zone, your higher command doesn't automatically know if you're getting shot at or if you're in an active gunfight. You need to call it in. And the reason you call it in is because you may need huge help. You might want air assets to come in and save the day. You might need a medevac. You might need reinforcements. And so basically, the instant you start getting shot at, commanders on the ground, or whoever's on the ground, could be someone super junior, they'll call into higher command and say, troops in contact, tick, 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 tick. And the reason they do that is basically to have help on standby. Now they're like, okay, we know something's going down, we're ready to support. And in fact, what we saw when we were in Afghanistan is, if anything, we were like too quick to call in a tick, because it's sort of like a cheat code, right? Like, oh, I think I heard gunfire way over there, call in a tick. And then immediately you got like warthogs overhead and crazy assets everywhere, like you're totally protected. Well, we sort of took advantage of it. And a lot of people did. Like, it's rare for the reverse to happen. Like, people are not conservative calling this in. And so for an entire unit to suddenly go like silent, having not called in a tick, it's either a huge like radio problem, but that usually gets resolved relatively quickly, or it's something else, something that is just harder to define because it just doesn't really happen very much. And so after a certain amount of time had passed, when still no one could get in touch with this unit, ultimately the Army decided this was, a big enough deal. There was enough people in that unit that were now unaccounted for, that they decided to send in an elite military unit to try to find them. And so they tapped this Green Beret unit. So the Army's top special forces team, the Green Berets, they grabbed a group of those guys and said, you go out into the mountains of Kandahar to their last known location and figure out what happened to them. And one of the people that was in this detachment of Green Berets was Mr. K, one of the people that gave pretty incredible testimony that I'm about to relay to you right now. So Mr. K and the rest of his small group of Green Berets, they hop on helicopters and they fly out to this section of Kandahar where, this infantry unit was last. And they touch down, and you got to understand that this is like rural as rural can be. There is, no people. Like, there's no cities, no nothing. There's like mud huts periodically, but it's just like mountains. You kind of feel like sometimes when you're in Afghanistan that you're like almost on a different planet. And so they touch down and they look around and they see nobody. Like, there's no locals. There's certainly no American military or NATO. It's just like a wasteland in all directions. And they know that the area they're searching is pretty sizable and it's very mountainous. So it's going to be like a very rough several days of basically hiking through the mountains trying to find any sign of this unit. And so they touch down and they all have like extremely heavy packs on. I mean, you got all your ammo, your equipment. Like, this is a rugged thing they're doing. And they start hiking through the mountains. Based on the brief that unit had given before they stepped out for this mission, they sort of had a rough idea, Mr. K and his unit, of the direction of travel. And so they're sort of following that direction. But as they're hiking through the mountains, I mean, the unit that Mr. K was a part of, they didn't find anybody. And for several days, I mean, they're out there in the mountains just hiking all day. They came into contact a couple of times with the enemy, but there wasn't even any ticks or anything. It was just like at a distance, like, oh, there's some fighters over there. But they're on a mission to find these missing soldiers. So they're not trying to engage with anybody else. Like, they're just hiking and looking for any sign of this unit. But again, for a few days, they couldn't find anything. Finally, though, on the fourth day of this rescue mission, so during the daytime, Mr. K and his team, they're walking along the mountain range, and they decide to take this goat trail that they can see right ahead of them. It sort of goes up and over the top of this mountain. They decide, okay, we're just going to take that goat trail and see what's on the other side. There wasn't any clear agenda for why this goat trail was of interest, but they're like, oh, everywhere else we're walking is just rugged and awful. At least this goat trail, a literal trail made by goats running along this area, is easier to walk on. So let's take that, we'll follow it to the other side, and we'll see what's up there. And also we'll be up higher and we can maybe get a view down into the valley on the other side, and maybe we'll see something. And so Mr. K and the rest of the Green Berets begin making their way up this goat trail, which sort of, meandered its way up and then eventually onto the other side. And as they're walking up, they start to notice these little bits of plastic and metal sort of strewn about on the trail. And at first, as they're walking, they don't actually know what they are. But as they keep moving, they start to realize that these are parts of military equipment. Like these are parts of radios and other stuff that would definitely belong to, for example, an infantry unit. And so now, like Mr. K and the others, they got their rifles sort of ready to go. They're walking up more apprehensively because they're thinking like, this is obviously connected to what we're looking for. Like, who knows what we're going to find once we cross the top of this mountain? Like, are we going to find like a bloodbath? Are we going to find the missing unit waiting for us? Like, they don't know. And so they continue walking up this trail, and as they get higher and higher, they find bigger and bigger pieces of military equipment on the ground, like whole military backpacks, like bigger chunks of radios. And then also they began finding bits of uniform, like military uniforms that even in some cases still had like name tags and patches on them. And they were able to see very clearly that those uniforms, at least, definitely belonged to the specific unit they were looking for. So they know, like, they've discovered their first real lead here, and it doesn't look good. And so up the goat trail they go, and they finally get to the very top. And I say this, I'm trying not to be biased because obviously I was a Navy SEAL, and I think very highly of U.S. Special Operations and their training. But, Green Berets and Navy SEALs, they're very different and definitely do different jobs. But in many ways, they are peers, certainly in terms of like the rigor of training. And one of the things that is just absolutely true, and I've seen it in combat, is that when stuff gets wild, like in a combat scenario, in a dangerous scenario, these Green Berets would have absolutely fallen into their training like flawlessly. This would not have been, no matter how crazy or how insane whatever they saw on the other side of the mountain, whatever it was going to be, they were ready for it. And so they would have been like dialed in, making their way up the mountain, getting ready to handle whatever's up there. And so, Mr. K and his team, they make their way to the very top of this goat trail. And when they crested the top, what they saw was like this plateau. So it wasn't like a peak, it was like this flat section of the mountain. And actually there was another section of the mountain that sort of went up beyond the plateau, and there were these huge like cave entrances that sort of basically fed out. These 3 cave entrances fed out onto this plateau, as if it was like the plateau was the front porch and the cave entrances are like the doors that lead into this upper section of the mountain. And on this plateau, scattered all over the place, is not just, more pieces of military equipment, but also pretty obviously human bones, or what appeared to be human bones, like scattered about. And there was, no living people up here. The missing unit was definitely not up here. But it looked like if they were up here, something horrible happened to them. And so once they reached the plateau, again, you got a picture like this elite military unit, they would have immediately taken up positions all around this plateau because they know these cave entrances have to be explored. You have to see who's inside of there. Like, is the missing unit in there? Are the remaining survivors taking shelter in there? Are there combatants in there? And so Mr. K and his unit, they sort of detailed taking up positions, getting ready to engage if they had to. And then once they were in position, Mr. K and the guy he was next to, his shooting buddy, if you will, were tapped to go up to the entrance of one of these caves and just look inside. And so silently they got up and they walked across this plateau while the rest of the team is sort of looking outward and also looking in. So there's 360-degree security. So Mr. K, he walks up along with his shooting buddy, and he said he looked into this entrance, this huge, massive entrance, like could easily just walk into this opening, but it's totally dark inside. And so he goes into the cave. And once he gets in there, like it's very dark, and he's sort of trying to look inside to see if he can see anything. And it does go back a little ways, but he barely takes a couple of steps into the cave when he realizes like there's like this sheer cliff within the cave. Like you basically walk in and then it shoots straight down. And Mr. K, he caught himself and he looked down to see if he could see what was down sort of in this pit within the cave, but it was just too dark, he couldn't see anything. And then, like, as he's standing back up again, getting ready to sort of assess what he should do next, he sees like a flash of movement in the far backside of the cave, basically beyond this crevasse that he can't cross. And so Mr. K instinctively raises his gun like he's ready to engage whatever this is. But before he can, this enormous spear, like a massive javelin, comes soaring out of the cave and impales the shooting buddy. His name was Dan, the other Green Beret that was next to Mr. K, who went up to explore the cave. The spear impales him, sends him flying back, and this is in plain view of all the other Green Berets. They all see this happen, and then like in the space of a few seconds, this massive, just enormous human creature, this like 12-foot tall thing, comes bounding out of the cave, clears the crevasse, and charges out onto the plateau. And it sort of looked like a huge person, but again, it's like 12 feet tall. It's got 6 fingers on each hand, 6 toes on each foot. It's wearing various animal skins, got this huge red hair, red beard, and it runs out to, presumably attack the Green Berets. But immediately they just start shooting it, and in like seconds, this massive creature falls to the ground, dead. And so at this point, like after the creature is down, I mean, nobody knows what to make of this, but again, it's like they fall back into their training. They immediately, once they know the threat is down and there's nobody else coming out of the cave, they run over to Dan to provide, life-saving care. But Dan's dead. I mean, he was killed by this javelin. And so now the team, they poked their head into the cave to make sure there wasn't anybody else, but as far as they knew, there wasn't. And for sure, this giant was dead, and so like they hadn't found the missing military unit, but now they have a casualty and like they have this horrible thing that's happened. And so one of the team leads for this Green Beret team, they end up calling higher command and they say, hey, you got to come get us. Like, we can't even tell you what just happened, but we have a man down, killed in action, and we have this combatant, this creature, we don't even know what to call it, but you got to get out here and you got to take this thing too. We don't even know what it is. And so not long after, 2 helos showed up, and one of them was to transport the Green Berets and to transport Dan back to the base. And then the other helo had this huge net that they basically wrapped around this dead, huge giant, and they strapped it up to the underside of the helo, and then they flew off with this giant. And, Mr. K and his unit, they expected to be brought back to base and to basically debrief the mission, which, in layman's terms means you basically talk through what actually happened and you sort of put it down in your after action report, like what happened, what mistakes were made, what did we do, like you basically put it on the record, like what happened. And you do it typically like right afterwards. Even if you've had like a casualty, you immediately document what's happened. And so they go back to base expecting not only to tell their story about seeing this giant, if you will, but to maybe get some clarification about what the heck just happened. Like, they wanted some more information, but when they got back to base and they did their after action report, which they sort of did on their own, nobody came to talk to them. The unit was sort of pushed off to the side and told to just, write down what you saw and just leave it at that. After they wrote it all down and they included, the truth, everybody on the team saw what they saw, they were told by higher command that they actually could not publish those details in their after action report, and they had to change it. Like we can't say you fought a giant in a cave. We can't say that. Like there's no way that's true. You can't say it. And so Mr. K and his team, like despite knowing it wasn't true, they went and they changed the report, and they just said they came in contact with the enemy, and the enemy, through small arms fire, killed Dan. And then after they submitted this, erroneous report, they were then told to sign all these non-disclosure agreements to basically say they would not talk about what they actually saw in that cave. And after that, Dan and the rest of his unit, they were basically told, you can't talk about this. This is too sensitive. And they even went looking for more information about it. And they found that all of the reporting in Afghanistan around that time about that operation had been heavily redacted. Mr. K never even found out what happened to the missing unit that they had gone out looking for. Like it was just this big mystery. But fast forward 14 years to 2016, and Mr. K just felt like he didn't want to keep this a secret anymore. And he spoke to some other members of his team that were there, and they too were just like really shaken up by what happened and just felt like it was wrong that nobody knew. And so that's what ultimately prompted Mr. K to go public with his story. And also when he went public, what he also discovered is that other people sort of in the military hierarchy also had some level of exposure to this giant. What Mr. K would discover is that after the giant had been hoisted in that net by that helo and flown off somewhere, apparently it had been brought to an airfield in Afghanistan, another NATO base and pilots that were going to be transporting this to another base remember seeing this 12 to 15 foot tall, giant looking person with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot in this net. They remember seeing it and actually describing it in their after action report. And they would say they were told not to include those details. And those details were redacted and made top secret. And so basically Mr. K, after coming forward, quickly learned through the grapevine that basically everybody affiliated with the giant was told not to talk about it. And the government basically shut it down, redacted it, and made it top secret. Now, I don't really know what to make of this story. There's a part of me that does want to believe that, the testimony of Mr. K is totally legitimate. But there's also a part of me that knows that, this could all just be made up. But a lot of people claim to have seen this thing. And I remember so distinctly, my own interpreter back in 2013 being so convinced that there was something in the caves in Kandahar and he really wanted to know more about it. It's like, there's some level of truth to this. I mean, I was, in Afghanistan and I was in the mountains of Afghanistan, not Kandahar, I was in Logar. But I mean, we used to walk by and look up and see these cave entrances. And I gotta tell you, it's unsettling. I mean, who knows what's inside of those things? It doesn't seem entirely impossible that a giant could be in there, like this is a landscape that's just, it's different. It's like a different planet out there. But, I mean, really what you're left with here is you have an entire infantry unit that's still unaccounted for, at least publicly, and you have an Army Green Beret in Dan who was killed in front of his team, and they want answers. And, it's like what you see is the government apparently went to great lengths to cover up what happened, or to at least disguise the truth. Whether or not they're covering something up remains to be seen, but I think there's more to this story that we simply don't know. But I'd love to hear what you think in the comments, so why don't you let me know in the comments and I'll get back to as many people as I can.
Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never before heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows.
All right, thank you all so much for joining me tonight at the campfire. And if you enjoyed this, remember, we actually have a whole playlist of campfire episodes that are ready for you to binge right now. If you want to do that, go ahead and click right here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.
On the afternoon of September 30th, 1991, an investigator in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, walked carefully through a college chemistry lab. It was also a potential crime scene. The room was a complete mess, with construction debris all over the place and lab equipment strewn across the countertops. In fact, it was so cluttered, the investigator didn't even know where to begin. But then, he noticed something that really stood out that was laying on a nearby counter. It was a soiled rag with a handwritten note sitting right next to it. And when he read the note, he gasped, because he realized he could be the next to die. But before we get into today's story, you might be asking yourself, why is this a Monday upload? Well, get used to it, because starting now, you're going to be getting a new episode every Monday. As mentioned in prior videos, I'm going to be uploading up to 4 new videos every week. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we do upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please steal all the mail in the Like Button's mailbox, and then just go ahead and restuff it with expired pizza coupons and mysterious credit card offers. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Early on the morning of August 19th, 1991, a 32-year-old man named Bobby Curley stood in his recently renovated kitchen in the city of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He walked over to his fridge, opened it up, reached inside, and grabbed his bag lunch along with his thermos, and he was just about to head out the door and go to work but he stopped and gave his wife Joanne a kiss on the cheek and said he loved her, and then he left for the day. So Bobby and Joanne had been married for a year, and they lived with Joanne's 4-year-old daughter, Angela, in a duplex in a working-class neighborhood. Bobby was an electrician, and so he made pretty good money, but the Curleys were by no means rich. However, Bobby knew that that actually might change soon, because Joanne was on the verge of winning this big court settlement. Joanne had actually been married once before, but her husband had died in a car accident about 3 years ago. His car had collided with a tractor trailer, and the driver of that tractor trailer was eventually found to be the one at fault. And so now, Joanne's lawyers and the trucking company's lawyers were finally closing in on a financial settlement to compensate Joanne for her first husband's wrongful death. It had been a really stressful process, and Bobby had definitely noticed that Joanne had been more sullen and stressed than usual as they were going through it. But now that the case was finally wrapping up, Joanne did appear to be sort of back in good spirits. And, while nothing was official yet, it looked like they were going to receive approximately $1 million in compensation, which was obviously really exciting. In fact, the two of them were already mapping out how they might spend some of this money. Some of the ideas they had come up with included taking Angela on a few big trips, and also maybe using some of that money to finally fund Bobby having his own business, something he had always wanted to do, but lacked the resources for. But for now, the settlement was not complete, and so Bobby had to go to his normal 9 to 5 and, punch the clock and keep earning money for the family. So for today, once he was outside, he simply got into his car and made the short drive to his current job site. 10 minutes later, Bobby parked outside of a science building on the campus of Wilkes University, which was a small college in Wilkes-Barre. He saw some of the guys on his crew standing out front, waiting to be let into this building. So Bobby, who was the foreman of their crew, he got out of his car and said good morning to everyone and then walked up and unlocked the doors. Then they all went inside and got to work. And working at this location had really become a pretty big routine for this group, because by now Bobby and his crew had been coming here, working here for a few months now. And this job was a really big job. Bobby and his team were helping renovate the entire building, which included all the classrooms, all the laboratories, hallways, everything. And so they still had quite a bit of work to do. But there was another reason this job was taking as long as it was. And that was because when Bobby's crew had first shown up at the building, they had expected it to be totally prepared for them, meaning all furniture and equipment would be cleared out. But instead, they found a ton of stuff just kind of everywhere inside the building, because the building clearly had not been prepped at all. The chemistry lab, for example, still had random flasks and chemical bottles and, wet rags with weird substances on them just laying around the room. So, as a result, Bobby and his crew had been forced to do a ton of cleanup, before they even got into their jobs that they had not planned on, and it really set them back. And so now, just to stay on schedule, they were regularly putting in 12-hour days basically every day they were there. And so all these extra hours had Bobby feeling completely exhausted, and lately, he had sort of felt kind of sick almost, and he just sort of chalked that up to basically overworking. But Bobby never complained. The overtime pay was great, and he really enjoyed working with these particular guys on this crew. These guys were basically his friends. So normally, the long work days were actually kind of fun, as exhausting and awful as they were. Later that afternoon, Bobby was standing on a ladder inside of that chemistry lab, running electrical wires above the ceiling panels. And as he was doing that, he suddenly heard this loud commotion coming from across the room. Bobby realized what he was hearing were guys on his crew basically shouting and laughing. So he climbed down to see what was going on. And when he walked over there, he saw that everybody was gathered around one of the members of the crew, whose name was Sammy DePasquale. And Sammy was sort of doubled over, coughing and spitting and holding a Coke can in his hand. Another member of the crew, whose name was Robert Marconi, explained to Bobby when he walked over that somebody had swapped out Sammy's Coke with a different Coke can, one that was filled with chewing tobacco spit instead of soda. Bobby cringed. This was absolutely disgusting. Even as a prank, this was awful. But it was also sort of par for the course for the guys on Bobby's crew. This is sort of what they did. They were always playing pranks on each other to kind of lighten the mood on long work days like today. And everybody was laughing, even Sammy, who'd been the butt of the joke. And so eventually, Bobby joined in too. He thought that this was ultimately good for morale, as gross as it was. And after a minute or so, Sammy recovered from his coughing fit from drinking this disgusting liquid and vowed sort of comically to get payback on whoever switched his Coke can. Then after that, all the guys got back to work. And so Bobby, he left the group and went back over to his ladder, and as he was climbing back up, he paused about halfway because he felt this sudden wave of sickness come over him. It almost felt like he had a flu coming on, which didn't really surprise him because he had been doing all these overtime hours and he really had felt run down as a result of it. And so again, he's just sort of chalking up the way he feels to overworking. And so as Bobby is standing on this ladder, he kind of told himself, just suck it up, this'll pass. And he just stood there on the ladder. And after a minute or two, that sensation of being sick did sort of pass. And then, because he was not a complainer, he was a hardworking guy, he just pushed the sickness feeling he was having out of his mind. He climbed back up and got back to doing his wiring. But 4 days later, on the morning of Friday, August 23rd, Bobby felt worse than ever. As he made his way across the college parking lot towards the science building where his crew was still working, he felt like his feet were heavy and he was constantly short of breath. And then as the workday went on, continuing to run wires in that chem lab, Bobby got really sweaty and really hot. His coworkers noticed and kept coming up to him to ask if he needed to go home early. But even though Bobby totally did need to go home early and felt awful, he would just tell them nope, he was just fine. And so Bobby would manage to get through that particular workday. But then at the end of the day, when it was time to go home, Bobby felt so relieved. He could not wait to just get home, crawl into bed, and sleep. But by the next morning, Saturday morning, that heavy feeling in Bobby's feet had turned into this really intense burning pain that actually went all the way up his legs. And then his hands went numb. At this point, Bobby had to admit to himself that this was not a symptom of overworking. He was sick, like something was wrong with him. So he went to his doctor. But the doctor told him that despite what he was feeling, the symptoms were not that serious. Like it didn't appear that something was seriously wrong with him. And so ultimately, he just told Bobby to, go home and get more rest. That's what you need right now. So that's exactly what Bobby did. For the rest of that Saturday and all day the next day, Sunday, Bobby didn't do anything except lay in bed. But by that Sunday evening, Bobby still felt horrible. So he picked up the phone and did something that Bobby basically never did. He called one of his coworkers and told them that unfortunately, he would not be able to come to work tomorrow. When Bobby woke up the next morning, on Monday morning, the day he had taken off from work, he was in so much pain that he couldn't even stand up on his own. His wife, Joanne, tried to help him get out of bed and go to the bathroom, but he was physically too heavy for her to lift. And so Joanne actually ended up calling Bobby's brother, David, to come over the house and help. But even with David there, who could now basically help move Bobby around the house, it was very clear to Bobby that whatever was happening to him was not some minor issue. Like this was serious, and it clearly was not going away with rest like the doctor had said it would. And so at some point that day, the family called an ambulance, which came and took Bobby to a nearby hospital. But by the time they got there, the pain in Bobby's legs had gotten so bad that Bobby was literally periodically screaming in pain, and he also had begun to vomit. But after several hours of nonstop pain and nonstop testing at the hospital doctors came into Bobby's room and they told him and his family that they actually had good news. They knew what was wrong with Bobby, and it was treatable. They diagnosed him with something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a condition where the body's immune system attacks the nerves and causes tingling in the feet and hands. But the staff assured Bobby that all he needed was a very specific medication, and then he would feel a whole lot better. Bobby was incredibly relieved, as was his family, and that day he began taking the medication, and quickly his pain became tolerable, he stopped vomiting, and before long, he actually felt good enough that he was able to go home. It seemed like Bobby had really turned a corner here, and that everything really was going to be okay. But within just a few days of being back home again, Bobby's pain came back even worse than before, despite still taking this medication. And he also began experiencing a new symptom. His hair started falling out.
On September 7th, so now a week and a half after Bobby came back from the hospital, well, he was back there again. And to Bobby's horror, this time, his doctors actually seemed kind of baffled by his symptoms. They told him that sudden extreme hair loss was definitely not a symptom of Guillain-Barré syndrome. So they told Bobby that it seemed like their initial diagnosis must have been wrong, despite the fact that the medication they gave him to treat GBS had helped him for a little while. And so the problem now was the doctors were basically at a total loss as to how to help Bobby. They really didn't know what was going on. And so for the next 9 days, doctors ran test after test on Bobby, and all the while, Bobby's pain intensified so much and became so constant that he basically fell into this almost delirious state, like the pain was completely too much. And then eventually, all these doctors who ran all these tests came back to Bobby and his family, and they just told them that we don't know what's wrong. Like, all these tests did not provide any clarity, and so basically we can't help you. And they told Bobby that now the only choice was he needed to be transferred to a bigger, more specialized medical facility in Hershey, Pennsylvania, which was about 100 miles away from Wilkes-Barre. A few days later, a neurologist named Dr. Robert Brennan walked down the hallway of the bigger hospital in Hershey, Pennsylvania. He was heading to the room where his patient, Bobby Curley, was staying. And even from several yards down the hallway, Dr. Brennan could already hear Bobby screaming and cursing at the nurses. Ever since Bobby had arrived at this hospital, his behavior had gotten more and more unhinged. At one point, Bobby had even thrown medical equipment across the room. And so now Dr. Brennan had to keep Bobby physically restrained to his bed. And so Dr. Brennan, when he reached Bobby's room, took a deep breath out in the hallway, and then into the room he walked. And inside, he saw Bobby strapped down to the bed, and he was screaming and thrashing around violently. And Dr. Brennan found himself just feeling awful about it. I mean, he felt really bad for Bobby. But really, he didn't know what to do for Bobby. He and his staff had tried basically everything they could think of to try to treat Bobby's pain, but nothing had worked. And so, on this day, Dr. Brennan couldn't do anything except what he normally did, which was just stand in Bobby's room sort of helplessly as Bobby screamed and flailed in pain. But on September 22nd, so 6 days after Bobby arrived in Hershey, he finally fell silent, because on that day, he slipped into a coma. 3 days later, Dr. Brennan felt very defeated as he stepped into Bobby's hospital room. There, he saw 5 members of Bobby's family: his wife Joanne, his 4-year-old stepdaughter Angela, Bobby's adult siblings Susan and David, and Bobby's elderly mother Mary. They'd all come to be with Bobby after he had fallen into this coma. Now, they looked up at Dr. Brennan expectantly. And Dr. Brennan, he took a deep breath, and he said he had some bad news. New test results had come back, and now, based on those results, they knew what was wrong with Bobby. Dr. Brennan told the family that what Bobby was suffering from was something called thallium toxicity. And when he said this, Dr. Brennan watched the family for some kind of a reaction. But the family just stared blankly at him like they had no idea what that meant. So Dr. Brennan went on and explained that thallium is an extremely toxic chemical. In fact, it can kill anyone who touches it, ingests it, or even just inhales its fumes. And he told them that, this is really unusual because thallium is highly controlled in the United States. It's actually banned in household products. So this is not a chemical that, Bobby just could have accidentally stumbled upon. This is pretty rare. And so at this point, Dr. Brennan just paused and let the family sit with this new information. And the family, they looked at each other like, wow, this is awful, but nobody knew how to react. They just kind of looked back at the doctor, waiting for him to explain more. But when the doctor didn't say anything, Bobby's sister, Susan, just asked in a quavering voice, what can we do? At that point, Dr. Brennan just shook his head and said, unfortunately, there's no cure for thallium poisoning. 2 days later, on September 27th, Joanne stood next to her unconscious husband in the hospital, and she nodded at the medical staff that was gathered all around him. It was ultimately Joanne's decision whether or not to keep Bobby on life support. But with no hope of a cure, Joanne had ultimately decided that the best thing to do was to take him off life support. And so after giving the signal to medical staff, Joanne, her daughter, and the rest of Bobby's family, they kind of stepped back from the bed, and they watched as the staff walked over and removed Bobby's ventilator. And then Joanne had to watch as her husband took his final breath. On the evening of October 21st, 1991, so about a month after Bobby died from thallium poisoning, a police detective named Harold Cawley sat at a big table with 7 other men inside of a steakhouse in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. The other men were a mixture of coroners and investigators from all across Pennsylvania. Some were from the Hershey area, where Bobby had died. The rest, like Cawley, worked for the police in Wilkes-Barre, where Bobby had lived. The men were there discussing the investigation into Bobby's death, and they had been doing this for the past 3 hours already, because there really was so much to talk about. They had already covered Bobby's initial autopsy results, which showed that he had a staggering 900 times the lethal limit of thallium in his system when he died. And so they were working under the assumption that Bobby must have been poisoned by a single massive dose of thallium. Whether accidentally or on purpose, they didn't know. And so they discussed theories for how this could have even happened to him. Because remember, thallium is not just a chemical you can get from the store. I mean, this is something that is highly regulated. So how did he come in contact with it? Their first thought had been basically what everybody else suspected, which was, Bobby must have been accidentally poisoned at the Wilkes University chemistry lab where he'd been working for so many months. And they actually had a bunch of records from a preliminary examination of the lab. And according to these records, one of the first things investigators had found inside of that lab was 5 vials of thallium in one of the storerooms. They'd also found a rag that was laying out on a countertop that presumably was there when Bobby first arrived and he and his crew began cleaning everything up. And next to this rag was a handwritten note that had a warning on it that literally said, "Thallium wiping rag, touch me and die." The rag had actually caused a huge amount of panic amongst the investigators when they had gone in to begin sweeping the lab for signs of thallium, because people were fearful that maybe they'd brushed up against it and touched this rag, and were they going to get thallium poisoning? However, they actually tested the rag and it came back negative for thallium, as did all the surfaces in the lab and also the air in the lab. And so the investigators had finally decided that that note must have been a joke or something. Also, the university insisted that all of its thallium was accounted for, meaning none of it could have been, stolen or misused in some way to poison Bobby because they would know about it. And so at this point, the university had actually been sort of ruled out as where Bobby got poisoned, which really didn't make sense to Detective Cawley or the other investigators at this dinner, because again, thallium is hard to come by. The idea that Bobby was working in a lab that contained thallium, but that wasn't where he was poisoned by thallium, seemed almost impossible. It had to have happened there. But they had gone out and tested all of Bobby's coworkers who had also worked in that lab with Bobby for so many days and so many hours, and they all came back negative for thallium exposure. However, Bobby's own family, his wife Joanne and her 4-year-old daughter Angela, they had tested positive for thallium exposure. Granted, it was on a near microscopic level because any amount of exposure could actually be lethal, and those two were okay, so obviously they had not received a lethal dose. But there were very small traces of thallium in both of them, which was odd. And so everybody at the table agreed that the right thing to do here was to speak to Joanne and see if maybe she had some ideas of how she and her daughter and obviously Bobby could have maybe come in contact with this very rare and lethal chemical. And then also, they need to get inside of the family's duplex to search it, literally, for thallium. But first, there was the problem of jurisdiction. Bobby had died in Hershey, but he'd gotten sick in Wilkes-Barre. So, after some discussion, the men decided that the Wilkes-Barre police should be the ones to head up the case because that is where Bobby actually got poisoned. The next day, Detective Cawley invited Bobby's siblings, David and Suzanne, to the Wilkes-Barre police station. And right away, it was quite clear that both of them were very suspicious of Bobby's wife, Joanne. They told Cawley that Joanne had been acting really strange for months, both before and also after Bobby's death. David said when his brother had first gotten sick, Joanne had barely lifted a finger to help him.
She'd called David to come over and look after Bobby, acting like she needed somebody strong enough to move Bobby around, which was true. But while David was upstairs literally carrying Bobby to and from the bathroom, Joanne stayed downstairs with her daughter and totally ignored them. She didn't even pretend to want to help. She basically let David do all of it. And Susan said, even though she didn't know for sure, her impression of Joanne right after she had taken Bobby off life support and he's died, her impression of Joanne was she was hugely relieved. Colley listened and nodded and sort of gave the impression that he was following along and basically believed them. But inside, he wasn't really convinced that what they were describing was highly suspicious behavior. When David came over to help Bobby, that was because she had asked him to do that, after trying at first unsuccessfully to move her husband around. And then when David was there, she does have a 4-year-old daughter. She can't just leave her unsupervised. Or maybe she doesn't want her daughter to see Bobby, and so she has to keep her downstairs. So there's an explanation for that. And as for Joanne being relieved after her husband's death, everybody dealt with grief differently. And Bobby's death had been a really traumatic, drawn-out process for everybody involved. So maybe she was relieved, but not because she was happy about it. It could have just been the end of a nightmare chapter in all of their lives. And so after he had listened to their concerns, Colley began to redirect the conversation, and he began asking David and Susan about their relationship with Bobby. They both said they were very close with their brother, even as adults. They said they lived nearby, and they saw each other quite a bit. David in particular said he spent a lot of time with Bobby. He said they often went fishing, and recently, together, they had renovated Bobby's kitchen. And this caught Colley's attention, because it sounded like David and Bobby had finished this renovation project around the same time that Bobby first got sick. Colley didn't know if this was relevant or not, but it was interesting. So at the end of their discussion, he just thanked David and Susan for all the information and told them they were free to go. A few days later, on the morning of October 25th, 1991, Detective Colley and 3 other investigators sat at an interrogation table in the Wilkes-Barre police station, right across from Joanne Curley, and the lawyer that she had brought along with her. Colley didn't know what to make of Joanne yet. Obviously, she and her daughter had also been exposed to thallium, so that could mean that they too accidentally were exposed to this chemical, same as Bobby, but obviously on a much smaller scale because they lived. Or they could have also been the target of somebody trying to poison this family, and ultimately just Bobby was killed from this poisoning. Or Joanne could be the poisoner. She could have poisoned her own husband. Bobby's siblings are talking about how awful Joanne was acting towards her husband in the wake of his illness. Maybe she poisoned him. And in doing so, she accidentally exposed herself and her daughter. Basically, Colley couldn't tell yet if Joanne was a victim or a perpetrator. So he made sure to watch her very carefully while another investigator began asking her to explain how and when her husband first got sick. Joanne said that Bobby had been complaining about feeling pretty run down for what felt like weeks or maybe even months, but he hadn't had any major symptoms until a week before his hospitalization in August. And she said that much like Bobby, she had just kind of chalked it up to he had been overworking, or maybe he had some standard illness that would just go away with rest, like that first doctor had said. She said that she had never even heard of thallium, and really at no point had it ever crossed her mind that maybe Bobby had been poisoned by thallium. As Colley listened to Joanne tell this story, he was struck by a couple of things. First of all, Joanne said Bobby had been feeling pretty run down for a while before his death. This seemed to conflict with investigators' assumption that a single massive dose of thallium had sent Bobby to the hospital and ultimately killed him. It seemed more likely, based on what Joanne said, that this poisoning happened over a period of time. And the second thing Colley was struck by was actually just Joanne's general demeanor. She had just recounted in detail, the story of her husband dying, this awful, awful death. Thallium poisoning is a horrible way to die. And as she's describing it, she's not shedding a single tear or really acting at all like she's even upset about it. And so at this point, Colley was beginning to wonder if maybe Susan and David had been right about Joanne. She really did not seem to care much about her husband's death.
And so what Colley did is he stopped the other investigator and he leaned forward and he just asked Joanne point blank, how do you explain how you and your daughter were exposed to thallium? And immediately, Joanne had a story, a bizarre one. She said Bobby really liked to drink iced tea when he was at work. So every morning, she would fill his thermos up from this big pitcher of pre-made iced tea that she kept in their fridge. And so Bobby would take that thermos with him to work and he would drink the tea all day and then come home with the thermos. And some days when he would come back, Bobby had not drank all the iced tea. There'd be some left inside the thermos. And so Joanne said what she would do in that case was she would take the remaining iced tea still in the thermos and she would pour it back into the pitcher in the fridge, basically to salvage what was left of the tea. And she said she and her daughter also drank from that pitcher. So in essence, she sometimes was drinking from the same tea that Bobby was drinking from directly. And so perhaps in that way, if he was being exposed to thallium, maybe it was getting into that tea that he was bringing home. And, she believed that maybe that was how she was being exposed, by drinking the leftover iced tea. Colley glanced over at the other investigators in the room, and they all looked as baffled as he was. This iced tea explanation was pretty out there, but it was so weirdly specific that they really couldn't write it off. And Colley knew that, if the iced tea theory was legitimate, it might be able to explain why all three people in this family, all living in the same place, had such drastically different levels of exposure. Basically, Bobby could be having this huge exposure to thallium outside the house, and then basically remnants of the thallium exposure are finding their way back into that leftover tea. So it's a really small amount of thallium. That's coming back home. It's being mixed inside that pitcher. And so when Joanne and her daughter are drinking from that pitcher, they're only getting a very small amount of thallium. And so again, it's out there, but it would explain it. So Colley asked Joanne if he had her permission to not just search her whole duplex to check for thallium, but specifically check her fridge, check her pitcher, her iced tea pitcher, and all the thermoses that Bobby brought to work to see if there was still trace levels of thallium inside of them. And he was worried when he asked her this question that she might refuse or give some reason that she couldn't, but Joanne immediately agreed without any hesitation. That same afternoon, Colley, his investigators, and a crime scene unit arrived at the Curleys' duplex to begin their search. Colley looked on as the crime scene unit entered the duplex and immediately began scouring every surface. And they found absolutely no trace of thallium anywhere in the house, except for in one very specific location. The thermos Joanne had already told them about, the one that Bobby would bring with the iced tea in it to work and then back again. Traces of thallium were found on the little ridges at the top of the thermos where the lid screwed back on. And this was huge, not only because now they had the first clear sign of exactly where this thallium was coming in and out of Bobby's life, but more specifically because it was at the top of this cup that obviously Bobby is drinking from. This showed that the way the thallium wound up in Bobby's system was because he ingested it. That was something they didn't know at this point. Now it seems very clear that's how it happened. But despite this revelation, it didn't explain how Joanne and Angela were also exposed, because when they tested the big pitcher of iced tea in the fridge, it didn't contain any thallium. And also, just finding the thallium at the top of the thermos didn't explain how it actually got there. But for Colley, what really stood out about finding thallium on this thermos was that this item, this thermos, is something Bobby took to work and home every single day. So it seemed like maybe, Colley and his staff had been too quick to rule out where Bobby was working. I mean, he was working in a chemical lab that contained thallium, and they had ruled that out as the place where he could have been poisoned. Now, it seemed like they needed to take another look. Seven months later, in late May of 1992, Detective Colley sat at his desk, thumbing through the notes from all the interviews and polygraph tests that he and his team had carried out since the previous October. One by one, they had brought in all of Bobby's coworkers and grilled them about Bobby's death. And all of the coworkers had more or less said the same thing. Bobby was well liked, and nobody they knew would want to harm him. Some of the coworkers did admit that they did like to prank each other a lot,
But they said the pranks had always been, pretty harmless, and spiking somebody's drinks with chemicals was way, way beyond anything they ever did. At least, that's what all of them said. But two of Bobby's coworkers, Sammy DePasquale and Robert Marconi, had failed their polygraph exams. In fact, the polygraph examiner said those two had literally gotten the worst scores he had ever seen. So very quickly, those two shot to the top of Cawley's suspect list. And so Cawley had pressed both of them about whether or not they had pranked Bobby by putting thallium into his thermos. Maybe they didn't know how dangerous thallium was, but did they put something in his thermos? And they said absolutely not, they didn't do that. But Cawley didn't believe them, because he'd already heard about previous pranks that involved swapping out coworkers' drinks for things like tobacco spit. So what's to say they didn't put thallium in Bobby's thermos? It just sort of tracked. The problem was, Cawley didn't have any actual evidence that he could use to arrest either of them, especially since the university continued to insist that none of their thallium was missing from the lab. Now, Cawley knew it was possible the university was wrong, that maybe there was unaccounted for thallium, but he had no way to prove that. Cawley also felt pretty suspicious of Joanne and also Bobby's own brother, David. Joanne, for obvious reasons, was still suspicious. She had thallium in her system. She seemed oddly detached from Bobby when he was dying, kind of letting other people take care of him, and apparently was relieved when he was taken off life support. But even if Joanne had wanted to poison Bobby, it was really unclear how she would have gotten her hands on thallium. And then as for David, the reason he was sort of suspicious to Cawley is because he spent a lot of time with Bobby. And he also did that kitchen renovation with him. And so there's all these moments where he's alone, potentially handling chemicals with Bobby before he got sick. So basically, David had the opportunity to poison Bobby, but there really was no motive. And just like with Joanne, Cawley felt like, where would David get the thallium? That was the big question. Where is the thallium coming from? And so at this point, Detective Cawley was basically at a dead end and just did not know how to take this case, which was heartbreaking because earlier that day, he'd been informed that the district attorney had decided to actually shut down the investigation into Bobby's death. The case was officially cold. And so since Cawley could not revive it, all he could do was close the case file and stick it in a drawer. One morning in August of 1994, so more than 2 years after the investigation into Bobby's death was shut down, Detective Cawley walked up the porch steps of the duplex where Bobby had lived, and he knocked on the door. Cawley had been thinking a lot about this case recently, and today he was hoping that Bobby's widow, Joanne, would help him take one last shot at cracking it. A moment later, Joanne answered the door, and once the look of surprise left her face, she invited the detective inside. Cawley quickly explained to her that the reason he was here is because there had been this technological breakthrough in toxicology testing. The Wilkes-Barre police were now able to perform a new type of test that had not been available to them 3 years ago when her husband had died. And Cawley believed that, this information they could get would help them figure out what actually happened to Bobby once and for all. Joanne's eyes lit up at this news, and she was about to open her mouth to reply, but Cawley quickly added there was actually a catch. He said in order to do these tests, they would have to exhume Bobby's body. And the only person who could give investigators permission to do that was Joanne. Cawley waited while Joanne processed everything she'd just been told. He tried not to let it show on his face, but Joanne's response to this would basically decide the entire fate of this case. If she said no, there really was nothing they could do. The evidence contained inside of Bobby's casket would be lost to them forever, which meant if somebody had intentionally poisoned Bobby, they would never figure out who it was, and so the killer would never be brought to justice. But unsurprisingly, Joanne said yes, of course. Later that month, on August 23rd, Cawley went to the cemetery where Bobby was buried, and he watched as a backhoe dug up his grave and pulled his casket out of the ground. The police and coroner then took custody of Bobby's body, and they would go on to perform these new toxicology tests. And when the results came in, they gave Cawley the exact information he had hoped for. Based on the police investigation, and critically, those new toxicology tests, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bobby Curley. The first time the killer slipped thallium into Bobby's thermos, Bobby was busy working in another room and didn't notice, which was exactly what the killer wanted. The killer did not hate Bobby. In fact, they really hadn't wanted to kill him until he had started talking about opening up his own business with that settlement money his family was going to get. And the killer just could not let that happen. Because if Bobby went into business for himself, he would ruin everything. The killer believed that by poisoning Bobby one time, that would kill him, and then all their problems would be solved. But the next day, Bobby actually seemed fine, sort of unfazed by the poison. So the next time the killer got the chance, they added a little more poison to Bobby's thermos. And when Bobby again stayed healthy the next day, well, the killer just added a little bit more the next time, and they just kept on doing that. They were afraid that if they added too much at once, Bobby might notice, and then they would get caught. So, for months, Bobby was being poisoned, but didn't really show any significant symptoms. But finally, in August of 1991, Bobby started showing really severe symptoms. Remember, his legs were in extreme pain, his hands were going numb, and when he called in sick to work on that Monday, that was when the killer knew. They were certain they had finished him off. Except they hadn't finished him off, because when he went to the hospital, Bobby just continued to cling to life. So the killer actually went to visit Bobby in the hospital, and while Bobby was sleeping, the killer slipped a final massive amount of the poison into a soda cup that Bobby kept by his bedside. And when Bobby woke up, the killer kind of casually encouraged him to drink the soda, and Bobby did so without any hesitation because Bobby had no reason not to trust the killer. Because the killer was his own wife, Joanne Curley. She had actually started poisoning him almost a year before she actually murdered him. But investigators didn't realize this until a new type of toxicology test allowed them to figure out exactly when Bobby was being poisoned. This test worked by analyzing some of the hairs that Bobby still had left on his body. Basically, every time Bobby was poisoned, a chemical marker was left behind in his hair. So as his hair grew out, the strands sort of became timelines that showed exactly when he had been poisoned. And when Cawley, through these tests, discovered that Bobby had been poisoned multiple times between October 1990 and September of 1991, these dates ruled out Bobby's coworkers and his brother David. The poisoning had simply started too early for David to be responsible and went on far too long for his coworkers to be guilty. But the timeline clearly ruled in Joanne. And when police began digging into why Joanne might have wanted to kill her husband, they realized she'd convinced Bobby to make her the beneficiary of his life insurance policy just days before poisoning him for the very first time. And so Joanne's motive was money. She did not want Bobby to have any of that financial windfall she was going to get from the death of her earlier husband, the wrongful death lawsuit where she was going to get $1 million, even though she kind of acted like, oh yeah, Bobby's going to use some of that to start his business. She didn't want that. She did not want him to have any of it. That was her money. So that was one motivation financially, and the other financial motivation was by killing Bobby, she would also receive the life insurance payout. As for where Joanne actually got the thallium, she would admit that she had used an old container of rat poison that did contain thallium that was manufactured in the US before thallium was banned in household products. On December 12, 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Joanne ultimately pled guilty and so was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She would wind up serving all 20 years and was released from prison in 2016. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Our stories typically have really big plot twists at the end, and today's story is no different.
However, the plot twist today is so unexpected, so abrupt, so shocking, so horrifying that I thought it would be interesting if you all tried to guess the ending as you're watching it, and you put your guesses in the comments section, and then we'll see if anybody comes even remotely close to what the ending actually is. I gotta be honest, I don't think anybody is gonna guess this one. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please change the 4th song on the Like Button's Sleep playlist to the loudest heavy metal death music you can possibly find. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the late summer of 1930, Raphael Pansardi and his wife Leonarda Cianciulli moved with their 4 young kids to a little town in northern Italy called Correggio. A terrible earthquake had destroyed the family's previous village and killed nearly all of their neighbors. And so this family was feeling very lucky to be alive. But when they arrived in Correggio, they really had nothing and were hoping that, the people of this town will just be very welcoming and generous and kind of help them get set up again. And the people of this town did exactly that. Correggio was this beautiful place inside of a fertile valley where people lived in these cottages surrounded by rice fields and mulberry trees. And the people who lived there were very tight-knit and looked after each other and cooked for each other and had parties together. I mean, this was a real community. And so when Raphael and Leonarda arrived, the townspeople immediately found them this cute little cottage by a stream with a whitewashed front door and a beautiful stone hearth for cooking. And there was an attached storefront on this cottage that they were giving them. And then on top of that, once the family had moved in, the family's new neighbors helped get Raphael a job, and they also helped Leonarda set up the attached storefront that was part of their cottage so she could sell her homemade soap bars out of this shop. And so very quickly, the family just completely fell in love with Correggio, especially 36-year-old Leonarda. Losing her home and her previous neighbors in that terrible earthquake had been a tragedy on epic scale, but it was far from the first tragedy that Leonarda had been forced to live through. Leonarda had been born into poverty. Her mother had actually come from a very wealthy family, but they had cut Leonarda's mom off when she became pregnant with Leonarda. And so when Leonarda's mom gave birth to her, she blamed Leonarda for their poverty and all of their problems, and so beat her relentlessly. And then on top of that, Leonarda's father died when she was very young, and so she was stuck at home being abused constantly by her mother. When Leonarda was 21, she met Raphael and fell in love with him, and he was a very kind and gentle man. He really made a very strong first impression on anyone who met him. But when Leonarda went to her mother and introduced Raphael to her and said, "I'm going to marry this man, I love him," her mother flew into a rage and then literally cursed Leonarda. She actually out loud muttered the spell and then told Leonarda that because of the spell, Leonarda would have evil following her forever. Now, of course, Leonarda was very used to her mother's terrible behavior, and so she did not actually think she was at risk of this curse affecting her life in any way. But not long after actually marrying Raphael, Leonarda began to see evidence that this curse might actually be real. It started with Leonarda having these sudden fits of seizures for no particular reason, and then Leonarda, every time she got pregnant, she would miscarry and lose the baby. And so feeling really sad and desperate because all she wanted was a family, Leonarda actually went to a fortune teller in hopes that they would tell her that in the future, her life got better, not worse, which to Leonarda meant, the curse was not real if my life improves. But after this fortune teller took Leonarda's hands and studied her palms, she looked up at Leonarda and gave her grave news. She said, "Leonarda, you're going to have living children, but they're all going to die young. and I see a prison and an insane asylum in your future. This experience totally shocked Leonarda and confirmed for her that her mother's curse must be real. And sure enough, over the following years, Leonarda and Raphael would go on to have 14 living children, and 10 of them would die when they were babies or toddlers. And so by the time Leonarda had arrived in Correggio with her family in 1930, she was absolutely petrified that her last 4 precious children would die because of this curse. And so in order to keep her kids safe, she basically never let them out of her sight, and then she also made sure they always adhered to these strange rules and beliefs that Leonarda had come up with about good and evil that were designed to somehow protect the kids from this curse. But the incredible show of generosity and support and kindness that Leonarda and her family had experienced when they arrived in Correggio had really done something to Leonarda. In fact, it really kind of changed the way she viewed the world. Suddenly, she was less concerned with this curse and how to protect her family from it, and instead, she was just kind of content. She felt safe. She felt happy. The women in the town loved Leonarda and always came by the house to say hi to her and eat some of the amazing tea cakes that she would make. And also Leonarda had become best friends with this woman named Virginia, who was a former opera singer from Milan, who was very elegant and beautiful. And every time she went to a dinner party, she would invite Leonarda. And also Leonarda and her family were becoming financially stable really for the first time ever. Leonarda's soap shop that she ran out of their cottage was really successful. People came from all around to buy her soaps because nobody could make them like she could. And Raphael's job as a clerk was very steady, and he too was becoming well respected in town. And so because of how well this transition to Correggio had been, at some point Leonarda made a promise both to herself and to the universe that instead of focusing all of her time and energy on this curse, which had plagued her whole life, instead she was going to focus on helping the people of Correggio any way she could, because they had done so much for her. And that is exactly what Leonarda did, but in a kind of ironic way. Because of the fear Leonarda had for her mother's curse, she had gone to that fortune teller many years ago. And even though the news she got when she saw the fortune teller was horrible, Leonarda had left that experience kind of fascinated with the art of fortune telling and magic and sorcery. It just really appealed to her. And so now that Leonarda was running this very successful soap shop out of her house, there were all these people coming from far and wide that would ask to barter for her soaps. Bartering is like trading one item for another item versus paying for something outright with money. And so Leonarda began bartering with these travelers whenever they had books about fortune telling, about magic, about sorcery, about how to make potions, about the occult. And after reading through all of these books and learning as much as she could, Leonarda, in addition to selling her soaps, began offering fortune telling services to the people of Correggio. And it would turn out she was really good at predicting the future, to the point where people in town basically began going to her for all kinds of advice. She helped women find love, she told farmers what crops to plant, she created these charm bags for people and told them they would protect them. She also began creating these herb potions for people when they got sick. It actually got to the point where people trusted her so much that when they got sick, they didn't even go to the doctor. They just went to her. And so very quickly, Leonarda felt very proud of the fact that she had lived up to the promise she had made both to herself and to the universe to always help the people of Correggio at every turn. But more than that, Leonarda was starting to think that this newfound sense of purpose and happiness she was getting in helping the people of Correggio through her various services had finally broken her mother's curse. By 1939, Leonarda and her family had been living in Correggio very happily for almost 10 years, and at the time, Leonarda's oldest son, Giuseppe, was 17 years old. Giuseppe was tall, he was handsome, he had dark hair, he had dark eyes, and all the girls loved him. And Giuseppe and Leonarda had always had a very close relationship. Every day, Giuseppe would come home, and he and his mom would sit in the kitchen, and they would chat for a while and eat some of her tea cakes. But now, in 1939, when Giuseppe was 17, he started to act a little bit different. He would come home, and instead of going into the kitchen to sit with Leonarda, he would just go straight to his room and shut the door. And when Leonarda or Raphael would ask him, hey, is everything okay? Giuseppe would get very defensive and say he was fine and to please just leave me alone. But to Leonarda, it seemed really obvious that her son was not fine, and she thought, maybe he has some sort of secret he's keeping, and that's what's making him act this way. He's hurting on the inside, but he can't share it with the world. But Leonarda had no idea what this secret might be. And then one day, late that same year, Leonarda was walking through town when one of her neighbors came up to her and said, "Hey, are you aware that your son, Giuseppe, has signed up for the military and he's leaving for training in just a few months?" Leonarda had not heard about this. People were talking a lot about World War II, which had just started around this time, but Leonarda had never considered that her precious son would go off to fight in that war. But now, Leonarda realized that Giuseppe's recent strange behavior suddenly made sense. This was the secret he was keeping. He had joined the military, and he hadn't told his family. Leonarda turned around and went straight home. She went right into her bedroom, shut the door, and she just sobbed. To her, it felt like her mother's curse was back, and now her precious son was going to go off into the war and he was going to die, unless she found a way to combat this evil that was now following her again. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. Growing up, I was always encouraged to speak up if I was feeling down or sad, and so as a kid, talking about my feelings was really easy. But fast forward to 2017, when I was in my late 20s and suffering for the first time from a severe bout of depression, it was like I knew what I was supposed to do, ask for help, but I just couldn't do it. It was like I was afraid if I told someone what my issues were, it would scare them, or worse, it would make them feel bad too. Luckily, my wife and my family encouraged me to go seek out a therapist, and honestly, that totally changed my life. But the point I'm trying to make here is that because of my upbringing, I should have been the first person in line for therapy right when I started struggling in 2017. But that's just not how life works. Oftentimes, the way we think we will act during a crisis is very different from how we actually act during a real crisis. So if you are struggling right now with your own personal crisis and you're hiding it from other people, you haven't asked for help yet, stop, take a deep breath, and do what I did. Consider therapy. And one of the easiest entry points into therapy is BetterHelp, because it's a world-class therapy service that is 100% online, which means you don't have to physically go into a doctor's office and awkwardly wait for your big first meeting with a therapist. Instead, you can get the help you need from the comfort of your home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a quick survey, and then you can choose how you want to communicate with your therapist, whether that's through chat or text or phone call or video call or some combination of all of them. Also, you can switch your therapist at any time for free. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/MrBallen. I've also linked them in the description below. Okay, back to the story. For the next several days, Leonarda did not open up her soap shop, she didn't come downstairs, she just stayed locked in her bedroom and read through all of her books about magic and sorcery and the occult, looking for some sort of solution for how to fight this curse. And finally, she figured out what she had to do. She read that if she gave something beautiful to the universe would reward her. And in Leonarda's mind, that reward would be sparing her son. And so Leonarda decided that the most beautiful thing she could offer the universe would be to help the people of Correggio, which she was already doing, but in her mind, she thought she could really ramp up her efforts and really try to change people's lives. And she thought if she could do that, the universe was sure to notice and it would save her son's life. Leonarda decided that the first person she would really go above and beyond to help inside of Correggio was a woman named Faustina. Faustina, who was in her 70s, was desperate to get married, but to many people in town, including Leonarda, she seemed kind of beyond help. She was totally antisocial, she was awkward, and just kind of given her age, it seemed like marriage was just not in the cards for her. But this is where Leonarda thought she could step in and change everything for Faustina. She would find her a husband. So Leonarda reached out to Faustina and told her about a friend of hers, a man who lived in a city to the north, who was also alone in his old age and who was likely looking for marriage, and she could set them up if Faustina was interested. And so Faustina was immediately interested and wanted to meet this guy, but Leonarda did tell her that, this guy, the reason he's not married is he's kind of difficult to be around. He's kind of a jerk, but he's got a wonderful heart. He means well. I think he'd be a great fit for you. And so again, Faustina's like, great, I want to meet him. I want to marry him. I'm ready. And then finally, the day came when Faustina actually went to this other town and met this guy in person, and they fell in love. And Faustina just moved right in with him. And before long, she was sending happy postcards back to Correggio, telling everyone about how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help in setting them up. And so Leonarda was obviously thrilled, not only for her friend's happiness, but also it really felt like she had checked the box in terms of really going above and beyond to help someone in Correggio in an effort to get the universe to spare her son. But her son was still a couple months away from leaving for training, and Leonarda, she's very superstitious, and she's thinking, okay, I don't know if that was enough to get the universe to save my son, and so I need to find somebody else I can help. So, in September of 1940, Leonarda began her next good deed project with another woman in town. She was a widow in her 50s named Francesca. She had worked as a teacher, but when her husband got sick, she quit her job, and then when her husband ultimately died, she was left with nothing. So, Leonarda reached out to Francesca and told her that she, Leonarda, would be willing to reach out to her own mother's rich family to see if maybe they had a job they could finesse for Francesca. Now, of course, Leonarda was not excited about talking to her mother's family, who had disowned her mother and had shown no interest in Leonarda, but Leonarda wanted to do this for Francesca and for the sake of her son and getting the universe to notice what she was doing. And so sure enough, Leonarda would reach out to her mother's family, and they were remarkably open to the idea, and they got a job for Francesca in Switzerland. And so eventually, Francesca jetted off to Switzerland, and then a couple of days later, she was sending postcards back to Correggio saying how happy she was and how thankful she was for Leonarda's help. And so again, Leonarda was so happy about this outcome, both because she cared about Francesca and also because this was yet another kind of check in the box of her good deeds that the universe was going to notice that in turn would save her son. But again, after Francesca didn't need any more help, Leonarda found herself looking at her son, who was getting closer and closer to leaving for training, and she would think to herself, have I done enough to protect him? Have I really stopped this curse from killing him after he leaves? And Leonarda eventually decided that no, she had not done enough. She needed to do at least one more really big good deed for someone in this town. And who better to help than her best friend, Virginia, the former opera singer. Leonarda knew from all her talks with Virginia that Virginia really missed living in the big city and going to the opera house. And so Leonarda reached out to Virginia and said, you know what? I can reach out to my mother's rich family and maybe they can find a job for you in a big city if you're interested. And so Virginia was like, wow, yes, I would love that. That's an amazing opportunity. And so Leonarda again would contact her mother's rich family, and again they came through, finding this job as a social planner for this very rich guy in Florence, Italy, who often funded plays and operas. And so this job was perfect for Virginia. When Leonarda told Virginia about this opportunity, Virginia cried tears of joy. After packing up all of her things, Virginia made a stop at Leonarda's house to say goodbye and thank you, and the two women would hug and laugh and cry, they would drink wine together, and then finally, when it was time for Virginia to go, even though Leonarda was very sad, she was also quite happy, because finally she felt like this good deed was enough to get the universe to spare her son. However, Leonarda, being a very superstitious person, did have one more little thing she wanted wanted to do with Giuseppe before he left for the military. And this little thing was her, Leonarda, bathing her son, her 18-year-old son, with a particular bar of soap, and then she also wanted to feed him a special kind of tea cake that she was going to make. The soap and the tea cake had these special herbs and ingredients and different things she had pulled from her books of magic and the occult, and they would kind of form like a protective barrier both outside and inside of Giuseppe. So, on the same night that Virginia headed off to Florence, when Giuseppe came home, Leonarda approached him and said, I want to give you this bath and I want to feed you these tea cakes. And Giuseppe was not remotely enthused at the idea of having his mom bathe him. He's 18. But he knew she was highly superstitious, she seemed pretty emotional about this, and it just seemed like it was extremely important to her, and so he said, okay. And so Leonarda washed her son with this special kind of magic soap, and then she also gave him the tea cakes, and then afterward, even though Giuseppe was really annoyed by what he had just been asked to do, Leonarda was so happy she was practically floating. She felt like she had done everything she could possibly do, and now she could just relax because her son was safe. But soon, Leonarda would learn that that was not actually true. A few days after giving her son the magical last bath and magical tea cakes, the police showed up at the front door of Leonarda's house. And when she opened the door and saw the police, she asked what was going on, and the police would say to her, hey, the 3 women that you supposedly helped that left town recently, they've all been reported missing by their families. They don't know where they are. And so Leonarda, she was totally shocked by this, and she said, no, that's not possible. I write to them all the time. I get postcards that come in very regularly from all of them. And then Leonarda went and got the postcards and showed the police, like, look, I'm talking to them. How could they possibly be missing? And so the police, they would look at these letters and they would agree with Leonarda that it is pretty strange that she'd be getting these very authentic seeming letters from these women if these women were also missing. And so eventually the police would leave and they would tell Leonarda that they would be in touch if they needed anything. And then over the next couple of days, Leonarda was very concerned about these 3 women, but she received numerous postcards from these women over those several days, and all of these postcards were totally normal seeming, and so Leonarda was fairly confident that whatever was going on with the police had to have been a mix-up, and she wouldn't be hearing from them again. But a couple of weeks later, the police did come back to Leonarda's house, except this time they didn't knock, they just barged right in. After the police had spoken with Leonarda that first time, they did some digging on these letters that she was receiving, and they managed to trace them all back to their start point. And it turned out all of these letters from all 3 of these women were originating from one place. It was this little town to the north of Correggio. And when police went to this little town, they discovered that these letters that were starting in this little town were all being mailed by the same person. And they got a physical description of this person who apparently was pretending to be these 3 women. And the description was of a tall, handsome young man with dark hair and dark eyes. It was Giuseppe. After the police barged into Leonarda's house, they went straight to Giuseppe's room where they accused him of murdering those 3 women, and then they hauled him out of the house and brought him to the station to question him about where he dumped the bodies. When the last police officer left Leonarda's house, Leonarda walked outside and just stood there wondering what she was going to do. It was like she had done everything in her power to protect her son from this curse, but somehow this curse she knew had done this to her son. And so now she knew there was only one thing she could do. Without saying anything to her husband, she went inside, she got her things, and she began making her way to the police station. At this point in her life, Leonarda looked much older than her actual age of 46. She had very gray hair, her face was very wrinkled, and she was stooped over, and she was always carrying these charm bags and magical potions and little stick figures that she claimed protected her family. And so her overall appearance when she wandered into the police station was that of a very frail old woman who was also very strange. And so Leonarda hobbled her way up to the front desk, and in a trembling voice, she asked the attendant if she could speak to the detective who was working on her son's case. And then a moment later, she was led into an interview room where she was told to wait. And then a little while later, the lead detective walked into the room. He sat down across the table from Leonarda and he said, "What can I do for you?" And immediately, Leonardo said, "My son, Giuseppe, is innocent." And the detective, when he heard this, he was not remotely surprised. In fact, this is fully what he expected this conversation was going to be. He knew Leonardo loved her son very much, and of course she was going to say he was innocent. This is what parents typically did in cases like this. But the detective decided he wouldn't try to stop her. He would just let this very distraught mother kind of talk for a bit. He would tell her that he would follow up on whatever she was saying, and then he would drive her back home. But this detective was not expecting the things that would come out of Leonardo's mouth over the next couple of hours. In fact, her story about why Giuseppe was innocent was so shocking and so bizarre that the detective outright said, "I don't believe you. I don't believe this. This can't be true." And then other officers were called in to listen to her story to see if they believed it. And they too said, "This doesn't seem real." But the police would follow up on the details she gave, and it all checked out. It would turn out, back in late 1939, on the day that Faustina, the first woman that Leonardo pledged to help in order to get the universe to save her son, when Faustina was set to go north and meet her future husband, Faustina stopped by Leonardo's house to say bye. And when she was in Leonardo's house, something very unexpected happened. When Faustina walked into Leonardo's kitchen where Leonardo was, Faustina was so excited about meeting her potential future husband that her hands were shaking and she was smiling ear to ear. And so Leonardo said to Faustina, "Hey, you need to calm down." And so she handed Faustina a glass of wine. And so Faustina took the wine and she had a couple of sips of wine. And right away, Faustina started feeling dizzy. And before long, she was grabbing the table just to keep from falling over. It would turn out the wine was poisoned by Leonardo. And so Faustina, she's kind of looking up at Leonardo. And Leonardo is looking down at her. And she's got an axe in one of her hands. And she says to Faustina, "I'm so sorry." And then she winds up and she strikes Faustina in the chest with the axe and lodges it in her chest. And so she lets go of it, expecting Faustina to die. She doesn't. Faustina's just standing there with an axe in her chest. And so Leonardo grabbed the handle of the axe. She pulled it out of her chest and then began wailing on her head over and over and over again until Faustina did fall to the ground dead. Then Leonardo lit a fire under her big metal pot on the stove, and then she cut Faustina's body into 9 pieces. She drained the blood out of the body into a bucket, and then she chucked those 9 pieces into the pot on the stove and began to mix them with caustic soda, which is a powerful dissolving agent that's used to make soap. And then she boiled the ingredients, her body parts and this caustic soda, for hours. Faustina's body slowly turned into this horrible black mush inside of this pot, and Leonardo was watching this the whole time, and she just had a look of total disappointment as this was happening. And then at some point, she just took the pot off the stove and dumped the ingredients, Faustina's body, down the septic tank. And then Leonardo waited for Faustina's blood that she had dumped out to coagulate, which means it became semi-solid. And then she heated it up in the oven and then ground it into flour. And she would use that flour to make tea cakes, which she fed to her friends the next day, as well as her son, Giuseppe. Leonardo also asked her son to mail some letters for her from the little town to the north where Faustina had supposedly gone. These letters, of course, were written by Leonardo, pretending to be Faustina, to give the impression that she was still alive and well. And Giuseppe, when he was told to go mail these letters, didn't think anything of it. He was used to doing errands for his mom. Even though Leonardo basically got away with killing Faustina, her plan for Faustina had not really gone the way Leonardo had hoped. When she boiled Faustina's chopped up body parts and this caustic soda, they didn't really mix the way she wanted them to. Leonardo was convinced that the reason for this is because Faustina was too skinny, and so there wasn't enough fat on her body for the mix to be perfect. So Leonardo had come up with another elaborate story, this time for another woman, Francesca, about that job in Switzerland she got through her mother's rich family. Of course, none of that was true, and when Francesca came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye to her, she was offered a glass of poisoned wine, and after she sipped from it, she became dizzy, and then Leonardo showed up with an axe and hacked Francesca to death. But again, when the body parts and the caustic soda were in the pot on the stove boiling together, they were still not coming together the way Leonardo wanted. And so again, Leonardo, with a look of disgust, just dumped the pot down the septic tank and wound up making tea cakes from Francesca's blood. Then the next day, she fed those tea cakes to her friends, as well as Giuseppe, and she also asked Giuseppe to send a few more letters from up north. These letters were, of course, from Francesca. Still feeling totally unsatisfied with how the last two killings had gone, Leonardo moved on to her third target, her best friend, Virginia. And this time, when Virginia came by Leonardo's house to say goodbye, everything went to plan. Leonardo was able to poison Virginia, she killed her with the axe, she chopped her up, she put her in the pot, and this time, the 9 chunks of her body mixed beautifully with the caustic soda. And so after adding a few fine perfumes into the pot, Leonardo was finally able to create the thing that she had not been able to create with the other 2 women's bodies. And that was a beautiful, rich, creamy bar of soap. She also, again, made tea cakes from Virginia's blood. That night, when Giuseppe came home, Leonardo demanded that she be allowed to bathe him with her magic soap, i.e. the soap made from Virginia's body. And so she did that. She scrubbed him with Virginia's body soap. And then while she was doing that, she fed him the tea cakes that were made from Virginia's blood. It would turn out Leonardo did in fact believe that in order to save her son from this curse, she would need to give something beautiful to the universe. And at first, she really had believed that the way to do that was by helping the people of Correggio above and beyond anything she had ever done before. But at some point during her interactions with Faustina, the first woman, Leonardo had decided that, you know what, that wasn't enough. She really needed to make sure that her son was going to be safe. And so the only way really that Leonardo could guarantee her son would be safe would be if she actually took a life and gave that back to the universe. That would save her son. The reason Leonardo wound up taking 3 lives and not just 1 life is because she also decided that as an extra protective measure, she wanted to make sure that she actually bathed her son, literally, in the body parts and kind of essence of the life she had taken. And so that's where the idea of the soap came in. However, the first 2 women, their body parts didn't mix right, and so she couldn't turn them into soap. But then Virginia came along, and her body did mix with the caustic soda, and so Leonardo was able to make her soap. She was able to bathe her son with Virginia's body and feed him Virginia's blood. And so in Leonardo's mind, she had done everything she could to protect her son at that point. Leonardo would ultimately be sentenced to 30 years in prison, as well as 3 years in an insane asylum, just as the fortune teller had predicted. Leonardo died in 1970 when she was 76 years old. As for her family, they fled Correggio, and 3 of her children changed their names and vanished. And her prized son, Giuseppe, who she had killed to protect, had gone on to join the military, and he would go to war, and he either was killed in combat or simply changed his name and vanished as well. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go in to the like button's sleeping playlist and change the 4th song to the loudest death metal music you can find. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we upload remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So, whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's gonna do it. See ya. I always tell my oldest daughter to do things that scare her, because oftentimes those are the things we actually want to do the most. And so today I'm going to live up to what I always tell my kid to do, because today I'm announcing my first ever live storytelling show. Doing a live event has always been so interesting to me, but it's actually just kind of terrified me, and so I gotta do it. It's going to be a digital live experience on February 16th, so roughly 2 weeks from now, and because it's so close to Valentine's Day, we decided to call this show the Ballentine's Day Show. And this 1 hour long show will just be me at my desk with no script, telling you crazy, strange, dark, and mysterious stories in real time. If this first show goes really well and people enjoy it and they want more of it, then I think there's a real chance we transition to a full-scale tour where maybe I could be telling live stories in campgrounds or in locations where some of these stories have taken place. We don't know yet, but it all starts with this first show. So to show your support and to tell us that you want a live tour, go get your tickets now. There's even some really cool special limited edition Ballentine's Day merch that you can get as part of a ticket bundle. Also, I'll be doing a live Q&A after the show that you can get a pass to as well. Go to moment.co/MrBallen to get your tickets, to get your merch, to get your after party passes. Again, that's moment.co/MrBallen. Happy Ballentine's Day.